This episode is brought to you by Dashlane. Try Dashlane Premium free for 30 days at dashlane.com/infographics. And never forget another password and keep all your online accounts secure. The People's Republic of China is huge. Not only is it the world's most populous country, with a population of around 1.404 billion people, it's massive land-wise. The country is approximately 3,700,000 square miles, making it slightly larger than the United States in land area. Although China spans 5 geographical time zones, the whole country follows a single standard time. China's home to 56 ethnic groups. Linguists estimate that there are nearly 300 living languages spoken in China, with Mandarin Chinese having the most speakers, around 955 million people. China is governed by the Communist Party of China, which administers the country from the capital of Beijing. The country is rapidly developing and is on track to become a superpower. Here are 6 places China is attempting to subjugate to expand its borders, economic, and global influence. Number 1. Tibet. China has a long and volatile relationship with Tibet, beginning in the 13th century and throughout different periods in history. Tibet has been ruled by Chinese and Mongolian dynasties and has also been an independent nation. In the first quarter of the 20th century, Tibet was ruled by Great Britain before once again becoming an independent nation. In 1950, Chinese troops invaded Tibet to enforce China's age-old claim to the country. Some areas became the Tibetan Autonomous Region and others were assimilated into neighboring Chinese provinces. In 1959, after a failed anti-Chinese revolt, the spiritual leader of Tibet, the 14th Dalai Lama, fled the country and set up a government in exile in India. During China's Cultural Revolution, many Buddhist monasteries were destroyed and thousands of Tibetans were likely slaughtered during martial law. Due to international pressure in the 1980s, China somewhat relaxed its grip on Tibet and implemented reforms. Currently, Beijing continues to modernize Tibet, sometimes at the cost of the region's cultural heritage. Development has brought Han Chinese migrants and Western tourism to the area. Since the early 2000s, there have been protests in Tibet, especially on the anniversaries of politically significant dates. Human rights groups say that China continues to politically and religiously repress Tibet. Various activists worldwide campaign for an independent Tibet. There are several strategic and economic motives China has for governing the region. Tibet is highly important to China's sense of self and Chinese nationalism. Many Chinese leaders, past and present, have believed that no matter the lines drawn on the map, Tibet is fundamentally a part of China. They felt a strong nationalistic drive to return China to its ancient, far-flung Qing dynasty borders. Tibet also serves as a buffer zone between China on one side and India, Nepal, and Bangladesh on the other. The Himalayan mountain range provides natural security as well as a military advantage. China is currently struggling to find a balance between environmental issues and yet not hinder the country's economic industry. China is hungry for natural resources and Tibet serves as a crucial water source, as well as possessing significant mineral wealth. Since the early 2000s, Beijing has invested billions in Tibet as part of its wide-ranging economic development plan for Western China. Number 2. Arunachal Pradesh. China also claims that the region of Arunachal Pradesh, the northeasternmost state of the 28 states of India, is a part of South Tibet and therefore a part of China. Aside from India, Taiwan also claims the South Tibet region. Arunachal Pradesh borders the Indian states of Assam and Nagaland to the south, and countries Bhutan to the west, Myanmar to the east. To the north, the demarcation line known as the McMahon Line separates Arunachal Pradesh from the Tibetan area of China. Historically, Arunachal Pradesh belonged to neither China nor India, but was dominated by several autonomous tribes. In 1913 to 1914, representatives from Great Britain, China, and Tibet held the Simla Conference to decide on the borderlines for Tibet. The Tibetan and British officials agreed on the McMahon Line as the border between British India and Outer Tibet. The Chinese representatives refused the demarcation line and have considered it invalid ever since. When China invaded Tibet in 1950 and the Dalai Lama later fled Tibet, India supported the Tibetan government, angering China. During the Sino-Indian border conflict in 1962, China captured most of the area of Arunachal Pradesh, but ended up withdrawing. In recent years, tensions have risen as China has publicly claimed the region of Arunachal Pradesh. China is especially interested in a small district called Tawang, which borders Tibet and Bhutan. China has even gone so far as to destroy thousands of maps and make new ones, having renamed parts of Arunachal Pradesh with Chinese names. India, while not growing as fast as China, is still emerging as a regional economic powerhouse. China wants to dominate Asia and sometimes seems to look for ways to clash with India. Most importantly, it's strongly assumed that there are heavy deposits of minerals such as gold and lithium in Arunachal Pradesh. A large-scale Chinese mining operation found gold and silver deposits worth around $60 billion in the Lunzi County of Tibet, which is directly adjacent to Arunachal Pradesh. Number 3. Aksai Chin. China and India also clash over another border region, Aksai Chin, near Kashmir. Aksai Chin is mainly in Hotan County, in the southwestern part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, with a small area on the southeast and south sides lying within the extreme west of the Tibet Autonomous Region. India claims Aksai Chin as part of the Ladakh region of the Jammu and Kashmir state. Aksai Chin is a remote, inhospitable region where mainly nomadic tribes roam. The area was ignored until the 1950s when China built a military road through it to connect Tibet with Xinjiang. India was angry upon discovery of the road, and it ended up being a major factor in the Sino-Indian border conflict of 1962. At the end of the clash, China retained control of around 14,700 square miles of territory in Aksai Chin. In 1993 and 1996, the two countries signed agreements to respect the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian-controlled territory from Chinese-controlled territory in Jammu and Kashmir. Not only does China want Aksai Chin for maintaining a direct route between Tibet and Xinjiang, it appreciates the territory for its strategic position. Aksai Chin is mostly high ground with an average elevation of around 17,000 feet. If China ever goes to war with its neighbors Pakistan, Kashmir, and India, the Aksai Chin region will enable it to take a commanding high position. Number 4. The South China Sea. As well as claiming disputed land, China has also claimed islands in the South China Sea. In fact, China has taken to dredging the sea and building out uninhabited islands such as Woody Island or the Spratly Islands to tighten its control over the region. 6 countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Brunei, Taiwan, and Malaysia, hold different territorial, sometimes overlapping claims of the South China Sea, based on various historical accounts and geography. Adding to the tension, the U.S. Navy frequently patrols the sea due to its alliance with several countries. China considers this to be a provocation. The South China Sea is very important to Beijing because it's a crucial commercial passage connecting Asia with Europe and Africa. 1/3 of global shipping, or $3.37 trillion of international trade, passes through the South China Sea. Furthermore, the seabed is rich with major oil and gas reserves. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates the region contains at least 11 billion barrels of crude oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Also, the South China Sea is a vital food source, accounting for 10% of the world's fisheries. In July 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China had no historic rights over the sea and that some of the rocky outcrops claimed by several countries could not legally be used as the basis for territorial claims. Beijing rejected the ruling. More recently, some Southeast Asian nations have considered having bilateral talks with China to settle the dispute. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has been working with China to create an official code of conduct to avoid clashes in the disputed waters. Number 5. Taiwan. China has had an ongoing dispute with Taiwan for decades. It views Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually be part of the country again. But many Taiwanese citizens want a completely separate nation. Historically, Taiwan was a part of China. Taiwan was governed by China's Qing dynasty from 1683 to 1895. When Japan won the First Sino-Japanese War, China had to cede the region to them. After World War II, Japan was forced to relinquish to China control of the territory it had previously taken. Civil war broke out in China in 1946 and ended in a victory for Mao Zedong's Communist Army. Chiang Kai-shek and his Chinese Nationalist Party, known as Kuomintang or KMT, fled to Taiwan. The KMT dominated Taiwan's politics for many years until after Chiang Kai-shek's death. Having inherited an effective dictatorship and under pressure from a burgeoning democracy movement, Chiang's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, began assessing a process of democratization, which in 2000 led to the election of the island's first non-KMT president, Chen Shui-bian. Meanwhile, China treated Taiwan with great hostility. In the 1980s, relations between China and Taiwan started improving. China put forth the One Country, Two Systems plan, under which Taiwan would be given significant autonomy if it accepted Chinese reunification. Taiwan refused, but did relax rules for its citizens to visit and investment in China. Since the 1970s, the US has been a close ally of Taiwan and has sold billions in defensive weapons to the country. Currently, US policy in the region has been described as strategic ambiguity, seeking to balance recognition of China's emergence as a regional power with the US support for Taiwan's economic success and democratization. In recent years, China has been alarmed by Taiwanese citizens electing politicians who favor independence from China. Furthermore, the Taiwanese public has staged various protests about Beijing's policies regarding the country. Currently, Taiwan's legal status is unclear, in limbo. The country has its own constitution, democratically elected leaders, and its own armed forces with about 300,000 active troops. China wants Taiwan to return to the fold because of nationalism. Also, Taiwan being a part of China is a strategic defensive move. If Taiwan was to become an independent nation with its close ties to America, the US would likely have a naval port and military base in Taiwan, right on China's doorstep. Number 6. Hong Kong. One final place where China is attempting to expand its power is Hong Kong. At the end of the First Opium War in 1842, part of Hong Kong Island became a British colony. Later, China leased the rest of Hong Kong, the new territories, to the British for 99 years. By the 1950s, Hong Kong had become a busy commercial port and a manufacturing hub. As the end of the 99-year lease approached, Britain and China held talks on the future of Hong Kong. In 1984, a deal was reached that Hong Kong would return to China in 1997 under the principle of one country, two systems. As a result, Hong Kong has a high degree of autonomy with its own legal system and borders, and rights including freedom of assembly and free speech for the next 50 years. However, in recent years, Beijing has been treading on Hong Kong's rights. Artists and writers say they're under increased pressure to self-censor, and democracy has been limited. The current leader was elected by a 1,200-member pro-Beijing election committee chosen by just 6% of eligible voters. Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, large protests erupted in Hong Kong in response to a proposed bill permitting the extradition of fugitives to mainland China. Citizens worry the bill will be used to target, detain, and extradite political dissidents. Beijing's response to the protests has become increasingly violent as the citizens show no signs of backing down. China considers Hong Kong a bridge between Asia and the West for business and financial matters. Also, once again, China's domination of Hong Kong seems to be fueled by nationalistic fervor. In mid-June 2020, World War III started trending on Twitter again. This time, it was because a border dispute in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian forces turned deadly, killing upward of 20 people. This is the first time since 1975 that the two countries have had a fatal conflict, and the most serious skirmish since 1967. Naturally, as the two nations are populous, militarily powerful, and have nuclear capabilities, the world is biting its nails to see what happens next. But assuming the whole thing doesn't end in diplomacy or a world-consuming mushroom cloud, which country has what it takes to bring home a final victory? Using a mix of historical precedents of the prior conflicts between the two countries and our knowledge of their current military capabilities, we intend to find out exactly whether China or India would win if the two nations went to war today. After all, we're not just talking about dusty hypotheticals here. Relations between India and China have been extremely strained since the Sino-Indian War of 1962, which occurred over the same stretch of the Himalayan border that's causing conflicts today. India had granted the Dalai Lama asylum within their borders after the fallout of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, already putting them in China's bad books. And with China's military encroaching on the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian and Chinese territory in the Himalayas, a military skirmish was practically inevitable. The resulting conflict was short-lived, lasting only 1 month and 1 day between October and November of 1962. The People's Liberation Army of China had a vast numerical superiority over India's military forces, and India suffered significantly greater losses, with nearly double China's deaths, many wounded, and over 3,000 captured. This loss is partly chalked up to the fact that it's believed, according to some leaked CIA documents, that India underestimated both China's military capabilities and their willingness to escalate the conflict. While India requested military assistance from the US in the form of 12 squadrons of fighter jets, their pleas were rejected, and India instead turned to Moscow for assistance. Ultimately, none of it did all that much good, as China claimed the eastern theater up to the line of actual control before declaring a unilateral ceasefire. India was left to lick its wounds, and tensions between the two countries have been high ever since, with conflicts still breaking out well into the 70s. Both nations have ramped up militarization around the line of actual control as a show of strength, and this has left both with very little room to maneuver. In a sense, the Himalayan border is a military powder keg, and lately we've been seeing the sparks. While a past record of military supremacy definitely works in China's favor, the Sino-Indian War was also 58 years ago, and failure is an excellent teacher. India has been engaged in frequent conflicts since the Sino-Indian War, giving their combatants invaluable battlefield experience. India is widely believed to have won every conflict they engaged in post-Sino-Indian War, with the exception of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, which ended in a ceasefire. China comparatively fought its last considerable conflict against Vietnamese forces in 1979. Once again, experience won out here, as the Vietnamese, who'd recently honed their skills in battle against the forces of the United States, are largely considered to have handed China's asses to them. This is why the value of actual experience in war can never be overstated. But let's take a step back and look at what these two militaries have to offer in terms of manpower, technology, training, and resources. First, soldiers, the bread and butter of any military. Much like the Sino-Indian War, China has numerical superiority, though in India's defense, seeing as China is ranked as having the highest number of active military personnel in the world at 2,035,000, China's military has numerical superiority over literally everyone. With over 500,000 reserve personnel who could be easily called into action in a wartime scenario, China is a force to be reckoned with. India, however, isn't all that far behind, with 1,237,117 active personnel and an impressive 960,000 reserve personnel, putting the difference between their totals in the mere hundred thousands. But here's the big twist. The numbers here only pertain to the Indian Army, which is the ground force branch of the Indian Armed Forces, whose total number of active personnel are 1,444,500, second only to the PLA's total active personnel. However, the overall numbers of reserve personnel for the Indian Armed Forces now dwarfs China's at an astonishing 2.1 million. The Indian Navy boasts 67,252 active personnel and 55,000 reserves. The Indian Air Force has 139,576 active personnel and 140,000 reserves. In contrast to India's three-pronged system, the PLA consists of 5 branches: the Ground Force, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and the Strategic Assault Force. The Ground Force is the Chinese infantry and land-based operations, with 975,000 active personnel. The PLA Navy has 240,000 active personnel. The Air Force even higher at 398,000 active personnel. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, also known by the pretty funny acronym PLARF, is the branch of the military in charge of the land-based ballistic and nuclear armaments. They have only 100,000 active personnel. And finally, the Strategic Assault Force. This is the newest branch of the PLA, established officially in 2015, dealing with extremely modern forms of warfare like space and cyber operations. This division is so new that we don't even have an exact number of active personnel, but due to the specialization of the job and the fact that the group is only 5 years old, it's safe to assume that it's likely the smallest branch of the PLA. However, we also have a far wider trend to consider here: the fact that China and India are two of the most populous nations on Earth, with populations of 1.393 billion and 1.353 billion respectively, as of 2018. In a situation of all-out war over their shared border, if both nations introduced conscription, the numerical differences between their armies would ultimately be nebulous. So, if neither army would have an extreme numerical edge in the case of another conflict, let's zoom in and take a look at the average military service member in each infantry, specifically their training, equipment, and weaponry. Thankfully for India, they've grown to invest in more intensive military training over the years, including joint operations training with the British, US, Japanese, French, and Australian militaries as their involvement in the UN deepened. The Indian military has also consistently invested in modernized primary assault rifle systems for their troops, currently working with a mix of American Sig Sauer 716 assault rifles and an Indo-Russian AK-47-203, a modernization of the famously reliable and hardy AK-47. As of 2018, Indian infantry troops are fitted with SMPP ballistic armor, even capable of withstanding blasts from the steel core rounds fired out of an AK-47. All these factors add up to one formidable individual soldier. China's infantry troops don't have quite the same thing going for them. Modern Chinese military training has been criticized for years for its lack of useful applications in real-life combat scenarios, meaning the average military skills of a Chinese infantryman may leave something to be desired compared to their Indian counterparts. They're formidable in the rifle department with the QBZ-95-1, a reliable bullpup rifle which performs best at long range. However, despite China being one of the world's most prolific exporters of body armor, it hasn't historically fitted its troops with that same standard of protection. The PLA is notorious for its light loadout, often leaving soldiers ill-prepared for taking fire, and giving the Indian infantry troops a huge comparative advantage. However, this may change in the not-too-distant future. According to a report from Global Times, China is investing heavily in updating and modernizing its training system, as well as planning on procuring 1.4 million units of high-quality body armor for the PLA. While this isn't currently a certainty, if these plans do go through, any advantages that the Indian Army may have had on an individual soldier level would essentially evaporate, leaving them dead even once again. But these days, war is far more complex than a large group of armed men running at each other and fighting down to the last one standing. In modern warfare, technology can give militaries the crucial edge they need to secure a victory over the enemy. Since 2008, China and India have ranked second and third respectively in global military spending, but the gap between them is still pretty immense. Last year, China spent an astonishing $261 billion on military development, compared to India's far smaller $71.1 billion. This disparity becomes a little more natural when you realize that China's economy is 5 times the size of India's. Let's take a look at how these numbers actually translate into vehicles for their armies, navies, and air forces. While China is generally packing more hardware than India, one exception is in the world of tanks, where India's over 4,200 stands over 1,000 units greater than China's 3,200 plus tanks. However, this doesn't paint the whole picture of China's ground capabilities. If we're looking at the number of armored ground vehicles overall, China's 33,000 dwarfs India's 8,600, giving them considerable ground superiority, bolstered by the fact that they have 10 times more rocket projectors than their Indian counterparts. China also holds dominance over the skies with 3,210 aircraft compared to India's 2,123. It also has approximately double the fighter and interceptor jets and 507 workable airports compared to India's 346. Once again, sadly for India, this trend continues into the country's navies. In terms of total naval assets, China outnumbers India by 777 to 285. More specifically, it has 74 submarines to India's 16, 36 destroyers to India's 11, and if wars were decided on equipment alone, it's unquestionable that China would take the win here. Of course, while nobody on Earth wants the conflict to escalate to this point for the sake of all human life, we'd be remiss to not return to the fact that China and India are both nuclear nations. If the war ever did become an exchange of nuclear force, who would come out on top? Well, for a number of reasons, China has a clear edge here. Not only did they develop their nuclear capabilities just over a decade earlier than India in 1964, New Delhi wouldn't have its first nuke until 1975, but their nuclear arsenal is also double the size of India's with a far quicker growth rate. China has a stockpile of 320 nuclear warheads, having grown by 40 in the past year. Compare this to India with only 150 nuclear warheads, which grew by a mere 10 in the past year. Both nations can deploy these warheads via the nuclear triad of missiles, submarines, and bombers, and thankfully for the human race, both have a no first strike policy. This means the warheads can only be used in retaliation to another nuclear attack, making it less likely that either country would want to strike first. Of course, if either did, all of us would ultimately lose from the resulting radioactive firefight. But on sheer numbers, China takes the clear win with regard to nuclear capabilities. One final factor worth considering is one that's rarely mentioned in a lot of abstract military planning: allies. While it's easy to think of war purely in terms of enemies, your diplomatic and military friends can also be a make or break factor in determining the outcome of a conflict. While China could largely be working a solo war against India with the exception of perhaps Pakistan, a country with fraught relationships with India to say the least, India itself has been building diplomatic relationships with a number of extremely valuable allies. These include the United States, a country with the highest military spending in the world, who under President Trump have gone cold on relations with China while referring to India as a major defense partner. India has also developed strong diplomatic ties to Japan, France, and Australia through performing a number of joint military drills with all of them. Having these various world powers behind them gives India a serious combat edge over China, providing these allies come to India's side in their time of need. While the US could be India's greatest ally in this speculative war, Foreign policy under President Trump has been known to be capricious and unreliable to other allies, such as the Kurdish forces in Syria in 2019. So there's really no way of telling for sure. So back to our big question. Who would win in a modern conflict between India and China? Turns out it's a lot more complex than you may have thought. While a layman might assume that China's apparent numerical and monetary advantages hand it an easy win, these advantages can be neutralized by India's stronger troops, who are better equipped, better trained, and more experienced, and its greater network of powerful allies. Then there's the strategic picture. As while the Indian Navy is smaller than the Chinese Navy, India itself is situated on the jugular of Chinese trade, so to speak. Chinese trade ships must pass through the Indian Ocean to reach their destinations, and while China may have a larger fleet, it's not very well equipped to conduct operations far from its own shores. With only 2 aircraft carriers with a capacity of about 24 aircraft between them, and one not even being operational yet, any Chinese incursion into the Indian Ocean to protect its trade fleets would be disastrous, as the Chinese task force would be brutally pounded by Indian air and naval power. With China receiving the bulk of its oil from maritime trade routes, a protracted war between the two nations would inevitably cripple the Chinese military and industry both. India would simply have to fight defensively, as the terrain separating India and China is extremely difficult and well suited to defensive warfare. While the Chinese could crush any Indian incursion into China itself, and there'd be few strategic targets to take close to the Indian border anyway, a war between the two nations would inevitably see India the winner, as it slowly strangles Chinese trade to death. You're sipping on a cup of steaming coffee in mission control of the China National Space Administration. The room is covered from wall to wall with glowing screens and monitors. You lean back in your chair and gaze through the wisps of haze rising from your mug. All is quiet as you're about to shut down the U-2 rover for its daily recharge. Suddenly, a scientist bursts through the doors, his hair disheveled. His eyes are as large as full moons. "You won't believe this," he pants. "We found something." You stand up and rush over to the scientist. You eagerly urge him to go on, but he has to catch his breath. The scientist finally stands up and sputters, We found something strange on the dark side of the moon." You take a step back and ask him to repeat himself. The scientist said, "I was going through the videos from U-2 and it picked up something strange, something that we can't explain." A million thoughts race through your head. What could the mysterious object be? You need more information, but you can't help the feeling of butterflies in your stomach as you think, could we have found life? Aliens? A crashed UFO? What is it? You ask as you shake the scientist. "We just don't know. It looks to be a gel-like substance. It's in one of the craters the rover was exploring. There shouldn't be any gel on the moon. There's no atmosphere and it's freezing cold," he responds. A gel-like substance, you think? How could there possibly be a gel-like substance on the moon? You run over to the red telephone on your desk and pick it up. There are no buttons to push. Once the phone is removed from the cradle, it automatically dials the head of the China National Space Administration. The line picks up and you speak into the receiver. "Sir, we found something. I think you should bring everyone in. This could be big." As you wait for your boss and the rest of the team to come in, you think back to December 7th, 2018, when the China National Space Administration launched Chang'e 4. The main goal of the mission was to land on the dark side of the moon and collect data. On January 3rd, 2019, China became the first country to successfully land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon. You smile as you recall that this was no small feat. Several other countries had tried and failed to do what your team accomplished. Landing on the dark side of the moon is difficult because of the inability to maintain constant communication with the spacecraft. The monstrous sphere that is the moon blocks the signals between Earth and any vessel on the other side. To get around the problem, you and your team placed a satellite between the moon and the Earth. The satellite is at an angle which allows you to maintain communication with Chang'e 4 at all times. Once the spacecraft successfully touched down, the U-2 rover drove off the lowered landing platform and cruised across the ancient moon dust. U-2 is the only rover that has ever explored the dark side of the moon. It's an exciting time for all astronomers and astrogeologists. U-2 will collect data that may uncover the mysteries of the moon's early history. You're brought out of your reminiscing when the entire team that's working on Chang'e 4's lunar project floods into mission control. The head of the China National Space Administration walks over to your terminal and says, "Show me what you found." You replay the video from U-2 showing the rover pulling up to the odd gel-like substance. It seems to shimmer like diamonds. It's day 9 of the mission, and you've been up for 24 hours straight, trying to unravel the mystery of what the U-2 rover has uncovered. After the scientists brought the strange object to your attention, you postpone all other driving plans for the foreseeable future, or at least until you can figure out what the heck it is you're looking at. The video footage is delayed by a couple seconds from the vast distance the signal has to travel. You have to program the rover to return to the position where it came across the gel-like substance. With the help of obstacle avoidance cameras, you maneuver the U-2 rover back toward the edge of the crater where the mysterious substance is located. You target the spot where the substance rests. The rover slowly pulls up and comes to a stop. You focus the camera on the gel-like substance. Everyone is holding their breath in anticipation. You cycle through different settings in the tools of the U-2 camera. You examine the substance in the visible light spectrum and then in the near-infrared spectrum. This detects light that scatters and reflects off the strange material. The collected information will help you identify the chemical makeup of the discovery. The data is surprising. You scratch your head as your team tries to identify the substance and understand how it ended up on the moon. One thing that stands out is that the mysterious substance has a unique color. It shimmers like melted glass and has a metallic sheen to it. The object resembles volcanic rock, like obsidian on planet Earth. The moon does not have any active volcanoes and its core has been dead for millennia. Therefore, it would seem that the substance was not created by cooling magma or other volcanic activity. So, what is it then? What could create such a unique substance on the far side of the moon? You and your team of scientists come to the conclusion that at some point a meteor flying hundreds of thousands of miles per hour slammed into the moon's surface. The moon does not have an atmosphere like Earth, so there's nothing to slow the impact of the meteor. There's no protective shield that causes space rocks to burn up on entry and create shooting stars like we see on our planet. The meteor rockets toward the lunar surface without anything to slow it down. The crust of the moon takes the full impact of the space rock. This releases an enormous amount of energy. It's analogous to a nuclear bomb detonating. On Earth, when nuclear weapons are tested, the rocks and sand in the area become superheated and create a glassy mineral called trinitite. The same process happens when meteors impact the moon's surface at high velocities. You and your team conclude that this must be what happened on the far side of the moon to create the unknown substance. The landscape is pocked with meteor impact craters. The lunar surface has been battered for billions of years by the unrelenting rocks hurling through space. It's too early to say with 100% certainty, but the gel-like substance you found is most likely not gel at all. Instead, it's probably similar to the rock formation that astronauts brought back to Earth during the Apollo 17 mission. After that mission, scientists who analyzed the glassy rocks from the near side of the moon concluded that their chemical makeup was consistent with a meteor strike. High-velocity meteor impacts release huge amounts of pressure and heat on minerals they slam into. This compression and superheating causes the chemical structures of regular rocks to shatter. Then, as they cool, the molten minerals reform into a structure that looks like shiny glass and bends light in surprising ways. Something that you and your team note is that this rare mineral may be abundant on the moon. Who knows what new technology and inventions could come from your discovery? You know that the properties of the mystery substance must be studied further. You've made an incredible discovery just 8 days into your mission for the China National Space Administration, but it's time to carry on. The moon holds many unexplained mysteries and opportunities for research. One of the most surprising discoveries you want to investigate further came from Apollo 17, when astronaut and geologist Harrison Schmitt discovered orange-colored soil near the spacecraft's landing site. It would seem that the moon has a knack for creating rocks and soil of interesting colors. The discovery was baffling at the time. Scientists concluded that the orange mystery soil was created during a volcanic eruption 3.64 billion years ago. Although the moon has not been volcanically active for billions of years, in the distant past the surface of the moon was covered with volcanoes. The time during the moon's formation was full of intense seismic activity. Its core was still molten and magma spewed out of numerous volcanoes across the lunar surface. You're hoping to gather more data on the moon's early volcanic activity during your mission. A different mystery your team may help solve was announced recently by NASA. This mystery has to do with the side of the moon where the U-2 rover was located. NASA recently found a massive blob of unknown makeup underneath the surface of the far side of the moon. This mystery blob has a mass relative to 5 piles of metal the size of the Big Island of Hawaii. The blob sits at least 180 miles beneath the South Pole Aitken Basin. The South Pole Aitken Basin is a colossal crater that was created billions of years ago. It was most likely formed when the moon's molten surface was beginning to cool. Before the surface could harden, an asteroid slammed into the crust, creating an enormous indented crater. But what lies below the surface? What is the huge blob? Maybe you and your team at the China National Space Administration can find out, since you are the only ones who have a rover on the far side of the moon. You and your team have already accomplished an astonishing amount in the short time the Chang'e 4 mission has been active. You use reflected radiation to analyze the minerals and composition of the moon's surface where the rover landed. The analysis of the landing site reveals two mineral types that are not a match for any of the known minerals in the moon's crust. Maybe these minerals came from the much sought-after lunar mantle. Scientists have been working for years to identify the makeup of the moon's mantle to understand its formation and the inner layers better. If you and your team can understand the moon's evolution, you could uncover the mysteries of the moon's magnetism. Did the moon have a magnetic field similar to ours in the past? How strong was the magnetic field? Which way was north? All of these questions could be answered by you and your team. The Chang'e 4 mission has relayed information about the lunar dust layer. The moon's dust is called regolith, and your team has discovered that it's thicker than previously thought. The spacecraft your team sent to the far side of the moon has measured the regolith at 39 feet deep. In the past, the dust caused problems to manned missions through clogging vents and reducing visibility. The dust itself came from pulverized rocks that settled on the lunar surface after billions of years of asteroid bombardment. You and your team have confirmed that this dust exists on the far side of the moon, and any future missions need to take into account the danger it poses. Your team, along with other scientists and astronauts, have dreamed of creating a lunar base, a place where astronauts and researchers can go to conduct experiments. It could also be a port or a building facility for spacecraft that will venture further into the solar system. The moon base could serve as the first stop on manned missions to Mars, Venus, or beyond. You now think about how the data collected by Chang'e 4 could be used to make the moon base a reality. You envision sending more rovers to clear the dust where the habitat could be built. Mining and drilling robots could be sent to harvest moon rocks and resources to construct the moon base. Perhaps the discovery U-22 made of the mysterious substance will end up being used in future technologies. Your analysis of the minerals on the surface of the dark side of the moon may reveal that it's an ideal location to set up a refueling station. Or maybe later in your mission you find that there's ice or water laying just below the surface of the moon, the most precious resource in all the galaxy. All of these dreams may be possible one day because of the success of the Chang'e 4 mission. The mysterious substance you found still needs further analysis, but it may contain materials that could further space exploration. The data that the China National Space Administration is still collecting from its mission to the far side of the moon may unlock the mysteries of the largest and brightest object in our night sky. Welcome back to another one of our episodes in which we dig deep to bring you tales of the worst things humans have done to each other in the name of justice. Today, we won't be talking about the dark past, nor are we going to describe to you something bloody and brutal, but what you're about to hear is certainly in the realms of shocking. The worst part is, this is going on in today's world. Without further ado, let's have a look at what have been called China's vans of death. They were introduced in China in 1997 and have been used ever since. You could say they're kind of like ice cream trucks that visit certain neighborhoods, except for the fact that they are, in the words of one human rights organization, like government-sanctioned death squads. Why would China do such a thing, you're likely wondering? Well, while most of the world thinks the death vans are barbaric, China thinks they're more humanitarian and more cost-effective than sending someone to a site of execution. As you'll see at the end, some people in China are actually very proud of their death vans. Let us explain why. We don't exactly know how many people are executed each year in China, but recent reports say that it's more than 1,000, which puts the country in first place for the number of executions. Back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it was estimated that the number of executions could have been 12,000 or more. There are 46 capital crimes in China, and we won't mention them all. 7 of them are related to crimes endangering national security, such as rioting and rebellion, urging people to separate from the state, or spying. You can also be executed for embezzlement or prison escape, for intentional assault, or even the production or sale of counterfeit medicine. So did people committing any of these crimes get a visit from the execution van? Well, first of all, like the USA, there are appeals processes in place for those that have been handed the death sentence. And since the mid-2000s, more and more sentences have been overturned. Vans don't just turn up at houses and start whacking people. There's a lengthy due process just like in most countries, and like in the US, a person can have a last-minute stay of execution. Under Article 252 of Chinese law, it's written that people will get the firing squad or be given a lethal injection of drugs. There's something else in that article that's important for today's show, and that's the fact that people can be executed at an execution ground or at a designated place of custody. Okay, so now you're wondering what an execution ground is. Well, things don't go down like they do in the USA. In China, if a person's to be executed by firing squad, an execution ground is set up, usually close to where the condemned is being held. This has 3 perimeters, with the inner circle being the execution place, the second circle being where the People's Armed Police guard, and the outer perimeter is where the local police guard. As you can imagine, that takes a bit of effort and money, so more and more people have been getting legally whacked at a designated place of custody. And this is where the vans come in. The vans only deliver a lethal injection. No one gets shot in the van, of course. In fact, it's written that in some provinces and municipalities, lethal injection is now the only form of capital punishment. A man named Kang Jung-wen designed one of the vans that was called the Jingwan Automobile Death Van. He said in 2006 that giving people lethal injection rather than shooting them was more humane. He also said the van is much cheaper than setting up execution sites that are not always in the same place where the crime took place. He said that's good for saving money, but it also acts as a deterrent when local people get to see the death van swing by their village or town. So what exactly happens? Well, when the death squad arrives, the prisoner is led to the van by at least 4 people. All this has to be videoed so that law enforcement authorities can see everything going down as it should. This is important because in the past, those doing the executions would sometimes harvest organs from the condemned and sell them. That's not to say organ harvesting of prisoners isn't still going on, but that's a story for another day. Let's just say that if organs are still harvested like Amnesty International seems to think, death vans would be convenient in another way. Not all the vans are alike, but we know exactly what the Jingwan Automobile Death Van looks like because Mr. Jung-wen was interviewed. He said in 2006, "I'm most proud of the bed. It's very humane, like an ambulance." He added that it's brutal to drag someone into the van, so the stretcher-like bed slides out of the van and the prisoner can be killed with ease. It's fast, it's convenient, and it's cheap, like a one-stop service for execution. Another thing pointed out, this time by a Chinese lawyer, is the fact that execution by firing squad can be messy, which is not good for the family of the deceased. He said that when a person is shot, he has to open his mouth so the bullet goes right through the head. That makes less mess and causes less distress for the grieving family of the deceased, but only if the executioner's aim is perfect. As you can see, for the Chinese authorities, the death vans are a winner in so many ways. That's why China has made about 40 of them to date, each the same, all equipped with CCTV and an electric-powered bed that comes out of the back. The lethal injection is no different from one you'd find in the US, and the service is delivered in the same way you'd expect in the US. So, you might ask, why are human rights organizations criticizing China for its death vans? Well, we said they're extolled for their convenience, but those organizations say they are too convenient. They don't deny that China isn't saving tons of cash, and they don't say the actual execution is any worse than it is in the US, but they say that mobile capital punishment just makes killing too easy. They say it'll lead to an increase in executions, and other critics have said that the vans are just a little too similar to the mobile gas chambers used by the Germans during World War II. As we said, we don't know exactly how many people are executed in China, but we do know some well-known people that got a visit from the van. A Chinese billionaire named Yuan Baojing went into the van in 2006 after being convicted of murder, corruption, and being part of a mafia-like company. He'd been in a long feud with another billionaire named Lu Han. And guess what? He also went into the van, but years later in 2014. Corrupt politicians are not exempt from the death penalty. In 2007, the van visited a Mr. Zheng Chaiyu, the former director of the State Food and Drug Administration of the People's Republic of China. He'd done shady deals with shady medicine suppliers and allowed dangerous drugs to enter China. He was paid handsomely in bribes, but people died because of the dangerous medicines. Seeing as the death van is convenient, we imagine hundreds of people are being visited by the van each year. In fact, one spokesperson for a death van company told the media, "We've not sold our execution cars to foreign countries yet, but if they need one, they could contact our company directly." We're not too sure if the death van export business has taken off just yet, but you never know. Maybe other countries will catch on to the convenience. In a recent press interview, President Joe Biden confirmed that United States men and women would fight to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. This prompted immediate outrage from China, who claimed the U.S. was violating its own One China policy. In response, President Biden ordered U.S. and Canadian warships to sail through the Taiwan Strait. For decades, the U.S. operated under a strategic ambiguity in regards to Taiwan, never truly committing to its defense, but strongly hinting that it would oppose a Chinese invasion with military force of its own. This had served as a diplomatic lubricant between the U.S. and China, as China sees reunification with Taiwan as a matter of not just national pride, but of survival for the Chinese Communist Party. A free and independent Taiwan is a direct affront to Chinese attempts to become a global superpower, something it has yet to achieve. If the nation can't neutralize one renegade province right off its own shores, it'll never be able to be a credible global power. For the CCP, Taiwan's democracy is an existential threat on their own grip on Chinese power. Now, President Biden has said the quiet part out loud, and China can expect to face U.S. forces if it attempts to invade Taiwan. But just what would the U.S. do in case of an invasion? A Chinese invasion of Taiwan could only take place during the 2 or 3 week window in either spring or fall, when the tides are favorable. Chinese forces could also only land on a limited number of beaches suitable for the offloading of infantry and vehicles, and all of these are highly defended and booby-trapped in advance. Further, an invasion would take months to prepare, giving Taiwan ample warning and allowing its Navy time to mine the Taiwan Strait. It would be the most costly military operation in terms of life and resources since the great battles of World War II, and even without the U.S. aid, China is unlikely to succeed despite its overwhelming size advantage. Much like the Greeks at Thermopylae, Taiwan is in a strategically superior position that allows its smaller forces to fend off China's hordes. In case of war, the U.S. response would be by air and sea, and it's unlikely the U.S. ground forces would come into play at all in the fighting. However, it's not impossible that U.S. Marine and Army forces could be committed to the defense of the small island in small numbers to bolster Taiwan's defenders. The first thing that would happen in case of a war is American submarines would begin their deadly work of decimating Chinese vessels. Despite an increasing capability in anti-submarine warfare, China's ASW abilities are still lacking, and U.S. submarines are very good at remaining hidden. The American Silent Service would be tasked with ambushing Chinese vessels attempting to navigate the Taiwan Strait, striking with surgical precision at troop transports and support ships, which would be more valuable kills given their limited numbers than actual warships. If China can't move troops and equipment across the strait, it can't invade after all. The Taiwan Strait would be a perilous place for any vessel to operate in, and U.S. submarine losses would occur, but losses on the Chinese side would be significantly higher. Up north, just south of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, a single American Ohio-class submarine converted to carry cruise missiles would launch a devastating attack against the oil pipeline connecting China to Russia. This would leave China with only one route for oil to take over land into the nation, throttling down China's oil supply. Oil would be the key to victory, as any modern economy requires it to function. China, however, is extremely vulnerable to trade disruption. This is largely the reason that the U.S. has paid little heed to China's threats. Approximately 60% of China's trade, including oil, travels by the sea, and this is China's Achilles heel. The nation might have the world's largest navy, but largest doesn't mean most capable, and China's navy has some serious deficiencies. For starters, its numbers are greatly inflated by smaller missile boats, and it lacks the logistical or defensive capabilities to send its ships far from its own shores. This means that while China's navy could operate around Taiwan's territorial waters, sending them much farther out to sea than that would be a deadly mistake. This is a situation that China has tried to rectify by expanding its influence in the South China Sea via artificial islands. These man-made floating airfields are packed to the brim with long-range missiles and attack aircraft, but they simply can't do enough to protect China's overseas trade. That's because any ship bringing oil to China must pass through the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, giving the United States 2 choke points to strangle China to death economically. Even before hostilities broke out, U.S. naval forces would be moving toward the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. American warships stationed right outside the Gulf of Oman would act as a first line of denial to Chinese oil shipping. To the east, the Straits of Malacca would be cut off to Chinese ships by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The end result is a near-total oil embargo on China that would leave it reliant on its own western overland pipes from Russia, which are, for the moment, out of reach of U.S. weapons. However, it's not unthinkable that in case of war, the U.S. wouldn't fly B-2 stealth bombers north through India to strike at these connections with standoff munitions. With very frosty relations between India and China, India is very likely to allow U.S. bombers to operate in its airspace for the mission. Even without striking these oil pipelines, though, China's oil imports would be reduced to a trickle, having immediate repercussions for its economy that would only worsen over time. If you've ever wondered why China hasn't actually invaded Taiwan yet, it's largely because the United States Navy has its foot on China's throat, and it would require minimal pressure to choke the country to death economically. U.S. carriers would doubtlessly join the fight in the skies over Taiwan, although to be honest, U.S. forces never need engage China, they simply carry out a blockade strategy. The only reason U.S. Air Forces would engage Chinese forces would be to carry out America's chief objectives in case of a war with China, the destruction of its air and naval forces so as to neutralize it as a future threat. Flying from airfields in South Korea and Japan, U.S. Air Force fighters could join the fight over Taiwan with the aid of aerial tankers, and operating out of aircraft carriers in the Pacific, U.S. Navy aviators would also be on the front lines against Chinese forces. However, American carriers would be under serious threat from Chinese ballistic missile attack, and that's why the U.S. Navy is working to greatly expand the combat radius of its fighters. The Navy's next-generation fighter, already in development, has a strict requirement of a combat range increase of up to 50%. Meaning the airframe will have to be significantly larger than the current F-18 Hornet or F-35. However, in the meantime, the Navy's also developing a fleet of drone tanker aircraft that can accompany fighters and top them off right before entering combat ranges. This would help put U.S. ships out of range of most, but not all, of China's long-range missiles. But it's at best a stopgap measure, as missile technology will continue to evolve, giving the weapons longer and longer ranges. Yet the U.S. remains confident it can operate its carriers in the Pacific in case of war. Fleet air defense vessels such as the Aegis cruisers can take on ballistic missiles with their complement of SM-3 missiles, which intercept ballistic missiles outside of Earth's atmosphere. To aid in their own defense, U.S. carriers are fast, very fast vessels for their size, with a publicly listed top speed of 35 miles per hour. However, it's a well-known fact that American supercarriers can move significantly faster than this when required, with a top speed that's classified. 35 miles an hour might not sound like much, but when you're targeting a vessel hundreds of miles from your launch site, this means that by the time your weapon nears the vessel's original coordinates, it's long gone. This is why modern long-range munitions require very robust surveillance, tracking, and targeting capabilities in the form of drones, AWACS aircraft, undersea sensors, and satellites, amongst others. Each of these assets forms one link in a long kill chain where platforms feed targeting data to an incoming missile. While China has made great leaps and bounds in its ability to hit U.S. ships at sea, it remains to be seen if China's kill chains can survive hostile contact with the U.S. forces. This by no means U.S. supercarriers are safe, and the platform is likely an outdated concept that we should very strongly consider scrapping in favor of more smaller carriers that leave the U.S. Navy less vulnerable to overwhelming losses from a single attack. Once American fighters are in the air, China will find itself facing the most advanced aerospace forces in the world. But this does not make U.S. planes invulnerable. In fact, China fields a longer-range air-to-air missile than the U.S. currently does, the PL-15. This missile has a slightly greater range than the American AIM-120D AMRAAM, giving Chinese fighters the advantage in a first-look, first-shoot confrontation. This is set to change in the next few years as the U.S. fields the AIM-260, which has a classified range but is believed to reach at least 186 miles, which is the range China's own next-generation missile, the PL-21, is expected to have. However, to actually hit U.S. fighters, China must detect them first, and this is why the U.S. spearhead will be its fleet of fifth-generation stealth aircraft. While not invisible to enemy radar, China's frontline fighters currently can't target American F-35s and F-22s until they're within approximately 35 miles, which eliminates China's slight edge in long-range air-to-air missiles. American fighters would be opening fire well before China's knew they were there. But stealth comes with a serious vulnerability, a lack of payload capacity. Flying in stealth configuration, a US F-35 is limited to 4 AIM-120s and 2 Sidewinders. This does not bode well given the fact that China would be committing dozens of aircraft at a time to the fight. While U.S. stealth fighters would be able to knock out China's front fighter screens, it's unlikely they'd be able to penetrate deep enough to strike at Chinese bombers, launching devastating standoff attacks against Taiwanese targets. To do so, U.S. fighters would have to fly in murder configuration, fully loaded with missiles on wing pylons and thus destroying their stealth signature. China has its own stealth fighters for the U.S. to worry about. The Chengdu J-20 is an inferior fifth-generation fighter, the bottom of the pile when compared to the F-22, F-35, and Russia's Su-57. It has decidedly non-stealthy features such as canards and engine outlets, and it's believed that it uses inferior radar-absorbent materials in its construction. To boot, China operates only about 150 of these aircraft, meaning they're in limited supply. Yet even inferior stealth is still stealth, and Chinese J-20s would pose a serious threat to American air support assets, such as tankers and AWACS, both critical platforms badly needed for modern air campaigns. Armed with long-range PL-15s, J-20s could easily stay out of detection of American AWACS and fire their missiles, all but certainly bringing these valuable air assets down. To date, the U.S. does not have a firm solution to this problem, which would be magnified by the fact that Chinese aircraft would be operating so close to home and thus within easy range of ground and naval-based air defenses. The battle in the sky over Taiwan would turn to one of attrition, which the US would inevitably win over time, but not without taking significant losses of even its precious fifth-generation fighters. The sooner the American public accepts that the F-22 and F-35 are not invulnerable, the better position America will be to accept combat losses and continue to muster the will to fight, because China would be looking to knock the US out of the fight not by military might, but by eroding public support for the war. After 20 years of disastrous adventurism in the Middle East, the American people have little stomach for yet another protracted military campaign against a foe that isn't necessarily threatening them directly. It's China's hope that it can cut the knees out from under America by inflicting large losses and shocking the American people. Yet, defending Taiwan is of critical national defense importance to the United States. Allowing the island nation to fall to China would severely undermine U.S. dominance of the Pacific, as it would give China the ability to break what's known as the First Island Chain of Containment. This is a chain of islands that hems China in from Japan down to the Philippines and has served as a barrier to Chinese naval expansion into the Pacific. Taiwan, however, is important to the U.S. and to the entire free world for another reason. Right now, the island nation supplies much of the world's supply of microchips and other computer components. Allowing this manufacturing capability to fall into the hands of the Chinese means that along with its own production capability, China would become the largest global supplier of these components critical to modern industry and militaries both. The Taiwanese embargo alone was a crippling blow to Russia's ability to manufacture new precision munitions. With China in control of the world's computer component manufacturing, it would effectively give the nation the ability to blackmail any other nation in the world and bully it into doing its bidding. This includes even the US. Do what China wants or else you get cut off from the critical supplies needed to keep your modern economy working. This is a strategic threat so great that even European powers have pledged some amount of support for Taiwan's continued independence. Luckily for Taiwan, though, the world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put a serious damper on China's ambition to conquer Taiwan. The unprecedented response from the West has shown China the lengths it's willing to go to in order to counter the aggression of authoritarian governments against free nations. Rumors swirl that China was actually planning to take military action this fall, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine completely derailed those plans. The last thing that China wants is to become a second global pariah, especially as its own economy faces some very serious internal disasters in the very near future. Not allies, but better than allies. This is how the Chinese describe their relationship with Russia. A statement meant to show mutual support and cooperation speaks far more about the divides between the two nations. The truth is, Russia and China have as much in common as they have in opposition, and it could spark a war. There are multiple points of contention in the China-Russia relationship. Both are autocratic dictatorships. Only China has at least given up the pretense of democracy. Both nations are seen as unfriendly to the current Western-led world order. Both nations suffer internationally for that. It would seem as if the two nations should be best friends, especially when their chief rivals are the United States of America and its extensive network of friends and allies. Yet differences that threaten war run deep, and if the two went at it, it might not end the way you think. Historically speaking, China has been the junior partner. After the triumph of communism in China post-World War II, the Soviet Union was quick to become a sponsor of the nation. However, ideological rifts soon led to outright border clashes, and just 2 decades later, the BFFs were on the splits, with China cozying up to the United States of all places. The US-China relationship would soon turn adversarial, however, and China re-gravitated back toward the Soviet Union. By the time this happened, though, the Soviets were on the verge of collapse, and the balance of power between the two nations changed dramatically after the end of the Soviet Union. While the Soviets had been the far superior power during the Cold War, China's rapid modernization during the 90s, Russia's loss of much of their former Soviet territory, and industrial and intellectual capacity led to a more even balance of power between the two countries. But Russia was always on the declining side of the scale, as its economic development focused on reactivating former Soviet capabilities while China was building brand new ones. Russia was annoyed at the fact that the former client state was now very much an equal partner, and as the balance of power continued to become more askew, with China's economy growing to over 3.5 times the size of Russia's. A new ideological divide has sprung between the two nations, with the Russians resenting that it's now the junior partner, and China reveling in their current superiority over the Russian nation. But there are very real material reasons for a decisive souring of relations between the two states. Russia has long resented the fact that the Russian Far East region is increasingly becoming, in the words of the Russian politicians, Chinese. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a major depopulation of the Russian Far East, made even worse by the fact that the new Russian state has failed to significantly increase infrastructure investments in the region. Illegal Chinese and Korean immigrants, meanwhile, have flocked to the region, along with a great number of very legal Chinese immigrants, alongside a lot of Chinese investment. The situation for Russia looks increasingly dire as Chinese firms pour money into the area, with the nation admitting that it has no other recourse but to accept the Chinese money. There's now a very real fear in the minds of Russian politicians that the Russian Far East will soon be lost to Southern Asian powers like China, not necessarily militarily but economically, as foreign control over the region's developed energy supplies is growing year by year via investments. Culturally, the region is also starting to swing toward China as more and more immigration and investment comes from that nation. With such a weak government, military, and economic presence in the region, it's not outside the scope of imagination that in a few decades, the Russian Far East may push for independence and absorption by China. China clearly has a reason to manipulate events and ensure this happens, as the Russian Far East remains very resource-rich. For energy-hungry China, whose economy has only recently begun to slow down, securing energy supplies is of critical economic importance. But it's a necessity for an altogether different reason as well. China currently has a massive Achilles heel that ensures it will not be able to militarily challenge the United States, and that's the fact that it imports most of its oil via sea trade routes that the U.S. Navy can easily disrupt. Secure landlocked energy resources that the U.S. cannot interrupt frees up the Chinese Communist Party to more directly challenge the U.S., even militarily if need be. To this end, China has been fiercely competing with Russia for control over the energy resources of Central Asia, exerting massive influence and swinging smaller nations away from Russia. However, there is one final point of contention that is deeply souring the Sino-Russian relationship. For decades, China was a dependable and loyal client for the sale of Soviet and then Russian weapons. With no modern defense industry to speak of, China bought most of its equipment from Russia. However, as China has modernized, so too did its defense industry, decreasing its reliance on foreign suppliers. But Chinese modernization has come at the expense of Russian trade secrets, with Chinese agents being caught red-handed multiple times, stealing or attempting to steal classified Russian technology. China has also violated the tenets of some of its licensing agreements with Russia, especially regarding its fighter aircraft. Multiple Soviet and then Russian fighter designs were approved for license manufacture in China, on the condition that China still purchase Russian engines and electronics for those aircraft, the two areas that China remains weak in. However, Chinese engineers began to reverse engineer Russian components and build their own copies of Russian engines and avionics. This greatly angered Russia. However, the nation was so cash-strapped that it had no other option but to continue allowing licensing of its fighter designs. China's maturing defense sector, however, means it has little need to continue licensing Russian designs. This is most evident by the development of the J-20, which is inferior to U.S. fifth-generation aircraft, but superior to Russia's own Su-57. To add insult to injury, Russia believes that China stole much of the technology that went into the J-20, driving an even deeper divide between the two nations. With egos, control over energy infrastructure and supplies, and increasing Russian desperation for recognition on the world stage, who would win if the two nations went to war? Since the end of the Cold War, Russia's military power has kept it firmly in the number 2 spot globally. However, estimates of Russian basic competency, availability of equipment, and effectiveness of their weapon system have proven to be severely overblown. Russia, it turns out, is utterly incapable of facing off against a modern military force and is best suited for minor conflicts against much weaker powers like Syrian rebels. Up against even a very small amount of NATO hardware, Russia has failed horribly in Ukraine, and the times it did go directly up against NATO weapons, its losses were catastrophic. Safe to say, Russia is no longer the world's second-best military. This leaves China as the world's second military power after the US, but the revelations about the Russian military has put China's own military power into serious doubt. China has historically struggled to clearly define its military doctrine. Despite being the far superior power, China was still militarily defeated by the much smaller and war-exhausted Vietnam in 1979. China claimed victory, yet failed to achieve its strategic objectives of preventing Vietnam from overthrowing Pol Pot from Cambodia, leaving no question to who really won the conflict. A lot of Chinese military doctrine was based on Soviet doctrine, and this only began to change in 1991 as the United States absolutely trashed much more numerous Iraqi forces, themselves deeply entrenched in Soviet doctrine. Beijing went into a state of panic. In the first direct confrontation between US and Soviet doctrine, the US was not just proven the winner, but Soviet military doctrine was proven to be vastly inferior. US doctrines of air-land battle and deep strikes using smaller number of more technologically sophisticated forces to sever lines of communication and disrupt enemy operations was so effective that in Moscow it was said that the only way to stop a US offensive was with nuclear weapons. Russia failed to learn this historical lesson, but China was an eager student. However, modernizing warfighting doctrine is not something easy for a nation deeply entrenched in the old Soviet order and dealing with massive amounts of corruption. Today, China has attempted to emulate the US combined arms operations within its own military, but while it's likely the superior emulator of US tactics, there's serious questions of just how good it really is. For starters, China's corruption problem might be as deep and systemic as Russia's has proven to be, severely eroding China's warfighting capabilities. It wasn't until Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purges in the late 2010s that China took any meaningful steps toward correcting a rampant and out-of-control culture of corruption across its armed services. But as many observers have pointed out, these anti-corruption purges might have been just as much political tools to eliminate rivals as they were tools to make actual progress on changing Chinese military culture, leaving the efficacy of the purges and real Chinese competency in serious doubt. The problem may still be as systemic as Russia's. For generations, the Chinese military operated on a tradition of gifting, where junior officers gave gifts to their superiors in exchange for promotions. This places little value on actual experience and capability, putting incompetent officers in command. Another serious question to Chinese capabilities is the fact that China is yet to prove that it can actually carry out modern combat operations of high intensity. For years, China refused to send its troops on UN peacekeeping missions for fear of being embarrassed by their performance. Even more telling, however, is the fact that China only recently modernized its military with a joint operations command structure similar to America's, allowing for its various military services to more easily operate together in combat and allow for real combined arms warfare. As encouraging as this news may be, though, China has also a very long precedent of insufficient or very low-quality training for its troops, with many of them being used for physical labor by their commanders in local infrastructure projects and training exercises being neither frequent nor realistic. To top it all off, it's important to remember that China has also never fought a modern conflict. So what would happen if the two powers went to war? If a war broke out between the two today, China would undoubtedly have the upper hand. Mongolia would become an unwitting avenue of attack for the Chinese forces, pushing into the very soft underbelly of the Russian Central and Far East districts. Historically, Russia has kept significant forces in the region to deter such an attack, but as the war in Ukraine drags on, men and equipment are being increasingly relocated to Ukraine. China, meanwhile, has no such commitments nor borders with potentially hostile nations, save for India. But the Chinese-Indian border is too mountainous for any serious land invasion to occur there. Chinese forces would be able to concentrate in the region, and with Mongolia largely doing whatever China tells it to, they'd have clear travel routes to the Russian border. The Russian Air Force would be integral in defending from a Chinese attack in the region, and here Russia does have a significant advantage. While the Chinese fighter fleet is more numerous at 1,200 aircraft versus Russia's 772, China still has a significant number of very old aircraft in its inventory, which would not fare well against Russia's one clear and decisive advantage: ground-based air defenses. Having prepared for decades to fight against the superior US Air Force, Russia decided to not compete with the US in the sky, but rather deny the sky to it by investing in air defense systems. Russia's S-300 and S-400, and now the S-500, are some of the best air defense systems in the world, even if they have trouble shooting slower HIMARS rockets down. With the air defense batteries already in the Central and Far East regions, Chinese air power would be seriously threatened if it tried to operate near the front lines, allowing Russia's Air Force to operate much more freely and directly threaten Chinese ground forces in a way China couldn't reciprocate. To add to China's difficulties, it would have to rapidly build up expeditionary airfields in Mongolia closer to the front lines due to its limited number of tanker aircraft and fighter aircraft capable of mid-air refueling. In terms of technology, the two militaries are likely at a healthy level of parity, but Russia is at a disadvantage due to the ongoing war in Ukraine and the effect of international sanctions. Predicting a victor and how such a war would play out becomes nearly impossible, given that the extent of Russian corruption and incompetence on the battlefield so far makes it questionable if it would ever be able to confront a near peer to the US, such as China. But while Russian deficiencies are in full display in Ukraine, China's own deficiencies are as well hidden today as Russia's were on February 23rd of 2022. One day before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was believed to be a formidable and capable military power who would steamroll a much smaller nation armed almost exclusively with legacy Soviet-era equipment. China, likewise, is today believed to be a modern and capable power, who's considered to be a near-peer adversary to the US. There are many indicators that China's own incompetency is as well hidden as Russia's was. The United States, meanwhile, has proven in various modern conflicts that its forces are extremely capable, even against significant threats. China has had no such opportunity. In all likelihood, a war between China and Russia today would devolve into a drag-down fight as both nations struggle to use modern doctrine alongside their high-tech weapons. The only conclusion we're comfortable making, however, is that in the case of war, the Chinese would likely neutralize Kamchatka and rout the Russian Navy. While China is still incapable of providing support for major naval operations far from home, Kamchatka is near enough to China and Russian defenses are light enough that the Chinese PLAN would likely emerge victorious. Once Kamchatka is secured, Chinese forces could begin a serious push for the Russian Far East, and while it's unlikely they would be able to threaten much of central Russia, the Far East region would likely fall to Chinese control and be annexed. With a great amount of energy resources there, even at a staggeringly high military cost, China would come out the winner. Here, we get to the crux of the problem, as Russia would inevitably use nuclear weapons once its territorial integrity was threatened. Without its own nuclear retaliation, Chinese forces would be annihilated, meaning that in order for there to be any victor in a serious Sino-Russian war, nuclear weapons would have to be used. Coconut trees, mangoes, and precision bombers. These are just a few things the Philippines brings to the table if China invades Taiwan. The Filipino and United States governments have come to an agreement that will allow the U.S. to expand its military presence to the northern islands of the Philippines. This deals a huge blow to any plans Beijing might have for invading Taiwan. But the Philippines isn't just a vital strategic location to launch a military mission against China from, it also offers several other advantages. There are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines, and China should be nervous about each and every one. The United States has 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific: Australia, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and the Philippines. However, if a conflict between China and Taiwan arose, the Philippines would be a stone's throw away from the front lines, as its northernmost island is only 118 miles or 190 kilometers away from Taiwan. And if Beijing decided to go full-blown Russia and invade a sovereign nation, the Philippines will almost certainly play a major role in the conflict in several ways. The Philippines would react almost immediately to an invasion of Taiwan, not because they necessarily want to protect the island, but because there are an estimated 200,000 Filipino nationals living and working there. The contingency plans are already being formed on how to bring every Filipino home if China invades Taiwan. But Philippine involvement in a conflict in the South China Sea doesn't stop there. In recent months, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. and his administration have been strengthening ties with the U.S. in case China tries to move on Taiwan. In fact, during a visit to Manila on February 2, 2023, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin declared that American commitment to the defense of the Philippines is ironclad. Our alliance makes both of our democracies more secure and helps uphold a free and open Indo-Pacific. This announcement was a major cause for concern in Beijing, and it came as little surprise when Mao Ning, a spokesperson for China's foreign ministry, responded to Austin's statement and the expansion of U.S. bases in the Philippines. Mao stated this is an act that escalates tensions in the region and endangers regional peace and stability. Regional countries should remain vigilant about this and avoid being used by the U.S. This rhetoric of destabilization whenever China feels threatened or needs to voice its displeasure over the actions of the U.S. is common. However, rather than blatantly stating that this new agreement between the Philippines and the U.S. is a way to keep Beijing in check and act as a deterrent to their aggression towards Taiwan, both countries state that military bases in the Philippines are just a continuation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014. This agreement was put in place to allow for combined training exercises and joint operations that were put on hold during President Rodrigo Duterte's administration, when there were discussions of reducing the Philippines' reliance on the United States and forging closer ties with China. It's clear today that Bongbong Marcos wants to return to the days where the Philippines had a stronger alliance with the U.S. We'll dive deeper into the complex relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines later on. However, it's important to remember that the U.S. colonized the Philippines in 1898, and by its very nature, colonization led to the exploitation of the Filipino people and unethical power structures being put in place. But unfortunately, the Philippines has a long history of being colonized by different outside forces, which is one of the reasons why they've kept such a close eye on the situation developing with Taiwan. If China were to attack and seize the island nation, the Philippines could be next, or at the very least, be forced to become submissive to the growing influence of the Chinese government. But this also goes the other way. Beijing has been keeping a close eye on the Philippines as its islands and close ties to the US may pose a serious risk to their future plans. Let's break down the 4 reasons why the Philippines is complicating China's plans to invade Taiwan and examine how this might prevent World War III from breaking out. Reason 1. Military intervention. If China ever does invade Taiwan, it'll be a difficult battle to win. This is because the island nation has been building up its military and preparing for the possibility of invasion for decades. However, if China launched the full might of its military against Taiwan and no other countries intervened, they would likely be able to capture the island given enough time. That being said, the invasion would be incredibly costly in terms of lives lost and resources expended, but the sheer size of the People's Liberation Army would allow China to eventually break Taiwan's defenses and secure the island. However, an invasion of Taiwan will not happen in a vacuum, and this is where the Philippines is becoming a major problem for China. The Philippine military itself is not the most formidable force in the world. It only has around 100,000 active members, which is significantly less than the approximately 2 million active personnel that the PLA has. The Philippines Air Force consists mostly of cargo planes, with only around 25 attack-type aircraft at its disposal, which would have no effect against the almost 1,200 fighters China has. The Philippine Navy is mostly composed of patrol ships, 2 frigates, and a corvette. China, on the other hand, has the largest navy in the world, with around 50 destroyers and 2 aircraft carriers at its disposal. So China is not worried about the Philippines military intervening in their plans to invade Taiwan. What they are afraid of is the fact that the recent agreement between the US and the Philippines will allow the US military to operate more effectively in the region. And if the People's Liberation Army went head-to-head with the US, they would lose every time. Therefore, the Philippines and its proximity to Taiwan may be one of the biggest complications in any future plans Beijing has for invading the island. The United States now has 9 bases in the Philippines thanks to the new agreement, which would greatly improve its ability to deploy aircraft and naval vessels to the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan. This will improve American resupply and operational capabilities in the region. It's suspected the U.S. forces will immediately begin using these bases for training and equipment storage while simultaneously improving their infrastructure. New runways are being built along with other facilities necessary to strengthen the U.S.'s position. With each new base, China's hopes of securing Taiwan without American intervention is slipping away. There are 3 main advantages that the new bases in the Philippines give the United States, which are 3 causes for concern in China. The first is the U.S. military will be able to increase the amount of training they can conduct in the region. It also means that other U.S. allies like Australia, Japan, and South Korea may also be able to join in more training missions as well. The more preparation and exercises the U.S. and its allies are able to conduct in the region, the more effective their forces will be in a conflict. Being able to practice maneuvers and tactics in the very location where a conflict might arise gives U.S. forces a huge advantage, and this is all thanks to the Philippines. This factor is particularly important for the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Marine Corps Aviation, which will now be able to easily conduct exercises utilizing tactical air formations necessary to be effective in an East Asian conflict. The Philippine bases will allow more frequent training, and although there's no real substitute for actual combat, U.S. military personnel now have the ability to train in the actual environment they would be fighting in if China ever invaded Taiwan. The experience in Asian combat environments that U.S. troops are now gaining is making Beijing incredibly nervous and putting a real damper on any future plans they had of invading Taiwan. The second reason the bases in the Philippines are a major complication for China is that the U.S. can use them as forward operation bases to project power into the South China Sea. The facilities in the Philippines will allow the U.S. military to procure supplies, conduct repairs, and carry out maintenance on its ships and aircraft. This will provide the U.S. with the opportunity to always have a fully functional force ready to strike at any given moment. One of the things that China previously had going for it, if they decided to invade Taiwan, was that the U.S. was on the other side of the Pacific and their bases in the region were some distance away from Taiwan. Now, however, the United States has several bases just over 100 miles from the island, and as the infrastructure is modernized, it could lead to U.S. forces being able to stay fully equipped and operational throughout a prolonged conflict. By allowing the United States military to operate freely and have 9 bases in the Philippines, Manila has provided the means for the U.S. forces to grow exponentially in the region. This has not only angered China but has them terrified. Beijing knows that it cannot win a war against the US, which is why they've been using gray zone tactics to weaken Taiwan and bring the island under its sphere of influence. However, this may no longer be enough, and any immediate plans to take Taiwan are now under serious threat because of the Philippines and the US bases there. The third and most obvious reason why the US military presence in the Philippines is complicating China's future plans is that the new bases will allow US forces to launch attacks across the South China Sea and target Chinese forces on the mainland. This would only happen if a full-scale war broke out, but it's the fact that the Philippines will act as a launchpad for combat operations that really has China scared. What it comes down to is that China is concerned about the continuously encroaching presence of the United States military in East Asia. Filipino and U.S. forces have already conducted joint combat exercises and disaster training in the Luzon Strait, the body of water that separates the Philippines and Taiwan. But now these exercises come with a new threat for China. The Filipino and U.S. militaries are clearly planning to defend Taiwan, which will be much easier with new bases in the northern Philippine Islands. However, it's worth noting that the Philippine construction prohibits the basing of nuclear weapons within its borders, so at least that's one thing China doesn't have to worry about for the time being. Reason 2. Economic opportunity. It's no secret that China has spread its influence around the world through trade agreements, shipping, and investment in foreign infrastructure projects. Beijing has been able to manipulate leaders, influence decisions, and sway international sentiment thanks to its rapidly growing economy. China's economic might is its main tool for spreading its power across the planet. However, nations that have closely allied themselves with the US, especially in Asia, are a thorn in Beijing's side. The Philippines definitely falls into that category. Over the past decade, China's been the largest foreign investor in the Philippines. However, Chinese companies are still nowhere near as dominant as US companies are in the country. American companies continue to be the top taxpayers in the Philippines and have contributed more over the years than any other nation to its development. That being said, many US companies take advantage of the cheap labor and loose regulations in the Philippines. But just in terms of economic impact, US companies have more invested than China does. During the Duterte administration, China hoped to weaken U.S. influence over the Philippines and control the country through economic means, as it's done with so many other nations. Unfortunately for China, they did not succeed in this endeavor. China still has companies and major investments in the Philippines, but the new administration is clearly looking to strengthen economic ties with the U.S. Manila and Cebu are two major trading centers in the region, and there are huge profits to be made by foreign players who utilize those ports. China is now worried that on top of its military expansion, the United States could use the Philippines to further its economic influence over East Asia. The U.S. has allocated more than $82 million for infrastructure improvements in the Philippines to enhance the access to resources and the capabilities of their bases. This is a huge investment that'll bring jobs and economic growth to communities around the military facilities in the Philippines. This is exactly what China has done in other parts of the world with growing economies. It's allowed them to hold power over other governments and influence their decisions. Unfortunately for Beijing, the Philippines will not be another one of its puppets. China invested heavily in the Philippines over the last decade, and now with a renewed alliance with the United States, their investments won't yield the results they had hoped. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Beijing expected one day to control the Filipino government through trade agreements and debt. Perhaps then China could have swayed Manila to support its claims that Taiwan was its territory. At the very least, Beijing hoped that its economic influence would keep the Philippines out of any conflict that arose in the South China Sea. However, this tactic has clearly not worked, which has the Chinese leadership worried. Reason 3. The Philippines is in a unique position to provide humanitarian aid to Taiwan. In the event that a conflict does erupt in the South China Sea, the Philippines will likely see an influx of refugees. This is not ideal for China's plans, as Beijing likely wants to subjugate the Taiwanese people so that the manufacturing capabilities of the island can be maintained once the invasion is complete. Taiwan manufactures over 60% of all semiconductors in the world. This has resulted in the small island becoming an economic powerhouse. However, the fact that the Philippines is so close to Taiwan and Manila has shown in the past that they're willing to take in refugees, Beijing may be nervous that unless they can blockade the entire island of Taiwan, huge amounts of talent and manpower will flee to the Philippines. If China attacks, there will be a mass exodus of Filipino nationals back to their homeland. With them will also come millions of refugees. Taiwan has a population of around 23.35 million people. It's very likely that much of that population who tries to flee will escape to the Philippines. There's also the fact that the United States military will be stationed in the Philippines to help with the refugee crisis and offer aid, housing, and services to those fleeing the Chinese invasion. The fact that the Philippines is in a unique position to aid the Taiwanese people by taking them in during an invasion is probably an annoyance for Beijing. The whole point of their gray zone tactics is to isolate and alienate Taiwan from the rest of the world. However, knowing that the Philippines and the US forces stationed there would be willing and able to help the people of Taiwan as they fled for safety is just another complication for China's plans. Reason 4. The Philippines could threaten China's influence in the region. This is probably at the bottom of China's list of worries, but it is worth noting that the Philippines' economy is growing fast. In the last 2 decades, the GDP of the Philippines has jumped from $94 billion to $394 billion. That's an average growth of around $15 billion annually. Over the last several decades, the Philippines' GDP growth rate has been around 5.7%, which is much higher than most countries around the world. However, China's annual GDP change has averaged around 8.7%. Even still, the Philippines' economy appears to be growing at a steady pace with no signs of slowing down. The economic success likely put the Philippines on China's radar in terms of countries to watch out for. Any threat to Beijing's power and influence in the region is not to be taken lightly. A rapidly modernizing Philippines is not something China is happy about, since Manila is so closely allied with the US. As of right now, China is more concerned about the military aspect of the Philippines-American agreement. However, in the future, the economic implications of a growing Filipino economy may be an additional cause for concern. Now let's dive into the history of the Philippines and how the US ended up with so many military bases on its islands. Unfortunately, the Filipino people have been mistreated by a number of nations when colonized, including the Spanish, Japanese, Americans, and even China. However, understanding the past can also help us better understand the power dynamics at play today. It'll also provide a glimpse into why Beijing is so concerned with how things in the Philippines are unfolding. In April of 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. After only months of fighting, the United States Navy destroyed the Spanish fleet stationed in Manila Bay, causing Spain to cede the Philippines to the US. It was at this point that the United States declared military rule and the American colonization of the Philippines began. The following year, General Aguinaldo declared the island should be free of foreign control and renamed the First Philippine Republic. He waged war against the American colonizers, leading to the Philippine-American War. After 3 years of fighting, the U.S. forces were victorious and the war ended. A U.S. civil government was installed. In 1935, political movements led to the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. The United States promised the country full independence within 10 years. Unfortunately, this freedom never came, as in 1941, a new colonizer took control of the nation. World War II was in full swing. Japanese forces invaded the Philippines and seized the northern islands. Atrocities occurred, including the massacre of entire towns and villages. It's estimated that as many as 1 million Filipino civilians died during the Japanese occupation. By 1944, U.S. forces reclaimed the island, and in 1946, the Republic of the Philippines was granted full independence. However, the U.S. military never really left the islands. In 1947, the United States was officially granted military basing rights throughout the Philippines. Over time, most of the bases were abandoned, and the U.S. military presence did eventually dwindle. However, in March of 1996, China fired a number of unarmed ballistic missiles across the Taiwan Strait, which splashed down just off the coast of Taiwan. The United States deployed 2 carrier battle groups to the waters around Taiwan to signal to Beijing to stand down and that an attack on Taipei would not be tolerated. It was this incident that led to the United States renewing its alliance with the Philippines and to begin strengthening its position in the region. In 1998, the Visiting Forces Agreement was signed and the number of American troops stationed in the Philippines increased. The United States and the Philippines began collaborating on fighting the War on Terror. Radical Islamist groups had begun operating in the southernmost sections of Mindanao. These terrorists claimed to have ties to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. However, in 2012, an incident led to Filipino and American forces refocusing their attention on China. A confrontation between Philippine and Chinese naval vessels arose along the Scarborough Shoal Reef in the South China Sea. Both nations claimed the reef belonged to them, as large reserves of oil and gas were found to be located in the area. Nothing came of the conflict other than the Philippines bringing the dispute before an international court, which ruled in their favor. Beijing refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the trial, and tensions over the Scarborough Shoal Reef continued. In 2016, Rodrigo Duterte was elected president and suggested the Philippines rely less heavily on the US and look towards China for the future. In hindsight, that wasn't a complete surprise. Duterte ruled over the Philippines using draconian methods and an iron fist to punish anyone found with drugs of any kind. Thousands of Filipinos were arrested and killed as a result of his policies. Duterte took more of an authoritarian stance than a democratic one, which might have been why he sought closer ties to Beijing. However, in March 2022, when an invasion of Ukraine by Russia seemed all but inevitable, Duterte came running back to the United States for protection. The concern was that if Russia was willing to invade its neighbor, then China might be thinking about expanding its own borders by attacking Taiwan. The concern was that after Taiwan, the Philippines could be Beijing's next target. Talks began, and it appeared the Philippines would allow the U.S. to resume operations at their previous base at Subic Bay and the nearby Clark Air Base. When Bongbong Marcos took over, the alliance was expanded to include 9 bases in total. It was at this point that China began to recognize the major role the Philippines would play in hindering its future plans for the region. It is worth noting that not all the Filipinos are on board with the deployment of American troops within their borders. The older generations remember stories of colonization and what it was like to try to build a country after centuries of foreign powers ravishing their lands and oppressing the Filipino people. It was in 1992 that the last American-controlled military base in the Philippines was shut down. American troops still operated in the country on joint training missions, but there were no longer United States bases on Philippine soil. The reason for this was that many felt like having US-controlled bases in the Philippines brought into question the true sovereignty of the nation. These same feelings are once again rising. The International League of People's Struggle is an anti-imperialist movement that seeks to warn people about the dangers of allowing foreign powers to have a military presence in sovereign nations and educate the world about the atrocities that happened due to colonization. They also voice concerns that in the past and present, U.S. troops perpetrated crimes against Filipino women and the LGBTQ community. This has included soldiers being tried and convicted of murder, sexual assault, and violation of human rights. However, in those cases, the American troops were almost always sent back to the U.S., where they were never held accountable for their crimes. Regardless of how the Filipino people feel, the government believes that having a U.S. military presence in the Philippines is vital to maintaining the status quo in the region. China knows that the Philippines poses a threat to its power and influence now that the U.S.-Filipino alliance has been repaired and new U.S. bases have been set up in the region. Marcos Jr.'s administration has stated the Philippines would stand by and assist the United States in any armed conflict that arose with Taiwan and China. The reality is that the Philippines was likely always going to be in danger if China invaded Taiwan due to its proximity to the conflict. The Philippines decided to take a proactive approach to this threat and allied itself with the United States for additional protection, money, and resources in the years to come. This has left Beijing furious, and it's clear they now see the Philippines as a major thorn in their side. With China rising fast as a strong contender for the new global superpower, many are wondering who would win in a battle between China and the USA. The US, which has traditionally paid close attention to Russian capabilities, is now looking across the Pacific as China develops new and more technologically capable military equipment and weaponry. Besides Russia, China and the US are currently the only other countries in the world to develop 5th-generation fighter jets, though only the US's jets are currently ready for frontline service. The US's formidable entry into this category is the F-22 Raptor, while in the late 2010s, China debuted its own Chengdu J-20 fighter jet. Who would win in a fight between these two powerful jets? First of all, you might be wondering what the big deal is with 5th-generation fighter jets in the first place. Are they really that different from 4th-generation fighters? Or is it like when your teacher makes you buy the brand new 5th edition of a textbook so you can then discover the only change is the font? Well, the truth is that the difference between successive generations of fighter jets is astounding. 5th-gen fighters are so powerful and feature so many upgraded capabilities that they pretty much render 4th-gen jets useless in any fight against them. Countries vying for global influence, such as the US and China, know that failing to keep up with such developments in military tech, especially in the Air Force, can make all the difference between winning and losing potential wars. At first glance, one might think that the US would have significantly more advanced military tech based on its spending alone. In 2020, China's official defense budget amounted to $179 billion. However, it's important to note that outside sources, including the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, estimate the actual Chinese military budget to be closer to $225 to $261 billion. The average of these institutes' estimates put China's military spending at around 1.9% of GDP. A recurring theme in this comparison will be that China perhaps understandably plays its cards close to its vest and is less transparent about its military specs. The US, on the other hand, has had a defense budget of approximately 3.2% of GDP over the last few years, with 2020's defense budget estimated at around $718 billion. If we take these numbers into account alone, it seems there's no way any of China's tech or military would be able to match the US soon. However, those direct comparisons don't take PPP, otherwise known as purchasing power parity, into account. Though the Chinese budget is smaller, Chinese products and salaries are also relatively cheaper than in the US, and this extends to the military as well. So taking PPP into account, China's spending is worth about 75% of that of the US. Still less, but nowhere near as wimpy as the original GDP numbers make it sound. Zeroing in on the 5th-gen fighter jets of each country, let's compare the F-22s and the J-20's specific capabilities. Many aerospace consultants and other experts complain that China ripped off much of the design for their J-20s from the US's F-22s, designed by Lockheed Martin via cyber attacks and espionage. That might be one reason why both aircraft have a ceiling of 12.4 miles and a max speed of just over Mach 2, approximately 1,535 miles per hour. One of the key differences is in the jet's range. The F-22 Raptor has a combat range of 497 miles, while the J-20 has a much larger range of 684 miles, thanks to a larger fuel tank. The F-22 has an actual range of 1,840 miles, but that's when it flies with 2 external fuel tanks, which would not be the case in a combat situation. That might sound like an advantage for the Chinese at first. However, Zhou Qinming, a Beijing-based military expert, pointed out that China's J-20 was only introduced in 2017 and has yet to be tested in a real combat situation. On the other hand, the US Raptors have been in use since 2005 and employed in combat situations around the world, including the Middle East, Singapore, and Okinawa. Besides the J-20 being relatively untested, another advantage for the US is the sheer number of F-22s that have been made. China has around 50 to 60 J-20s in total, while the US currently has 187 operational F-22s with 8 more in testing. When it comes to specific capabilities, such as the weapons the Chengdu J-20 can hold, experts have to make educated guesses since China refuses to release many details. The J-20 has a broad but shallow weapons bay, which can hold between 4 to 6 long-range missiles or bombs. We know the F-22 can carry up to 6 missiles for either air-to-air or air-to-ground combat. The weapons each jet carries are important, but they may actually be less important than each jet's stealth and detection capabilities. The F-22 is incredibly hard to detect and track, giving it a natural stealth advantage. After all, the best weapons in the world can't shoot what the plane's technology can't see. The J-20 is thought to be similarly hard to detect from the front. However, there are elements on the aircraft sides and engine nozzles that may make it more susceptible to radar detection. The next great consideration is maneuverability. In a dogfight, the more agile jet will usually win the day. However, it's also important to note here that the increasing speeds and weapon range of modern-day fighters have rendered dogfighting much less important and frequent than it used to be. In fact, the only US aircraft to have been involved in a dogfight in the last 20 years was in 2017 when a US Navy pilot shot down a Syrian fighter. Generally, pilots these days are trained to avoid or negate dogfights. That being said, maneuverability still gives jets tactical advantages in non-dogfight situations. Many observers, especially those who closely watched the Zhuhai 2018 airshow, believe China has overstated the Chengdu J-20's capabilities. Military experts believe it is probable that China's J-20 is less maneuverable in a dogfight and therefore at a disadvantage against the more agile F-22. Others point out that the J-20 was made to function optimally with high-thrust WS-15 engines, which China is struggling to refine and produce. Therefore, current J-20s are relying on less optimal Saturn AL-31F M2 turbines imported from Russia, which would definitely affect their current maneuverability. China did recently announce that they'll start mass production of the J-20B, a more agile line of fighter jets, in July of 2020. Though these might pose a bigger threat to the US Air Force, many reports of China producing updated and mightier aircraft have proven to be false, and it seems this may be the case with the new release as well. Overall, the lack of specifics known about the Chengdu J-20 due to China's tendency to keep details about their military specs and military programs secret, combined with the Chinese government's habit of releasing misleading reports, makes a comparison of the J-20 and the USA's F-22 very difficult. Most military experts believe that currently the F-22 would handily beat the J-20 in a fight. However, some are concerned about the future because China is continuing to fund and refine its J-20 production program, while significant updates on the F-22 have stalled, especially since F-22 manufacturing facilities were shut down in 2011. Another concern is the missiles the J-20s are carrying, known as PL-15s, one of the top air-to-air missiles in the world. PL-15s have much higher effective range than their current U.S. counterparts, the AIM-120s, and are built with top-of-the-line anti-jamming technology, which U.S. counterparts don't necessarily have. However, the Pentagon is currently focused on developing a brand new JTAM, Joint Advanced Tactical Missile, which they're convinced will be the best air-to-air weapon in the world when completed. Even with the Pentagon developing new air-to-air missiles and the F-22 probably forging ahead with scheduled upgrades in the 2020s, thus pushing it further ahead of the J-20 in terms of modern tech, observers caution that the J-20 is at a relative start of its production run, meaning the advantage may shift over to China over time if the U.S. isn't careful. A recent comparison of Chinese and U.S. air superiority from 1996 to 2017 by RAND shows a rapidly closing gap in Air Force capabilities between the two countries, which would seem to reinforce this concern. In 30 years' time, watching this video will be illegal in your country because China will have dominated the world. The Chinese Banksy, the man known simply as Baidu Chao, recently had his exhibition in Italy protested by the Chinese government. Infamous for speaking out against the Chinese Communist Party, China lobbied the Italian government to have his show cancelled. When that didn't work, the nation threatened Brescia, the Italian city where Baidu Chao's exhibition was being held. With warnings that continuing with the show would put any future collaborations in jeopardy, the city ignored the warning and the Italian government refused to shut the show down. Then the Chinese government moved to threaten Baidu Chao himself. They first ran propaganda pieces on Baidu Chao through state-run websites within the Great Chinese Firewall, casting into doubt his character and making baseless accusations against him. The government actively encouraged anti-Baidu Chao sentiment among Chinese social media while censoring any pro-Baidu Chao posts. Then things got personal. Chinese people began to show up at Baidu Chao's exhibit, claiming to be supporters. Getting close to the artist, they began to deliver warnings about how dangerous Italy could be. One even mentioned how people die on the streets here for no reason in Italy, a clear death threat. Today, Baidu Chao is forced to live in Australia where he doesn't contact his family for fear the Chinese government will go after them instead. But if China has its way, soon nowhere will be safe to hide from the Chinese Communist Party, not even the United States of America. If you think this is far-fetched, consider China's response to the interruption of the 2022 Olympic Games torch lighting ceremony in Greece when pro-Free Tibet protesters crashed the ceremony to demand accountability for the genocide of 1 million Uyghurs in China. After the event became public, those involved in the protest had their identities leaked online to receive thousands of death threats, mostly from Chinese social media users, ironically using a VPN to bypass Chinese censors. This is hardly the first time that Beijing has used public outrage it creates to target its critics and even endanger lives. When the media team of University of New South Wales removed an article and tweet in which Elaine Pearson, the Australian director of Human Rights Watch, spoke about China's curtailing of human rights after the Hong Kong riots, pro-Chinese Communist Party students across Australia flooded the university's social media pages with hate messages. The irony here once more being that if they did this in their own country, they'd be jailed for it. But it's no laughing matter, as Australia has a large Chinese population and there are now concerns over how to preserve free speech in the face of overwhelming Chinese intimidation of China's critics. If you thought the US, a country known for its staunch defense of free speech, is safe from Chinese influence, think again. In 2020, 5 people were arrested in what the US officials called an aggressive Chinese government operation to track down dissidents and critics of Beijing in the United States and repatriate them. This operation, codenamed Fox Hunt, was according to Beijing part of an anti-corruption campaign where the targets were supposed to be brought back home to China for trial. That is frankly terrifying, as it's clear China was willing to bring these critics who sought safety in America home no matter the cost, possibly even involving kidnapping. The scary thing is that by U.S. officials' own administration, China has several of these squads in operation across the United States, and finding and neutralizing them is now a top priority in order to protect the rights of Chinese immigrants in America. Chillingly, one of those agents caught by authorities had left a note on the door of one man they were seeking to bring back to China, which read, "If you are willing to go back to mainland and spend 10 years in prison, your wife and children will be all right." That's the end of the matter. Would China seriously murder the family of a dissident on U.S. soil? If the threat against Baidu Chao is to be believed, the answer is yes. And in a world where China is the top power, there is no room for free speech or criticism of the Chinese Communist Party. China's current president, Xi Jinping, took power in 2013, and since then he has worked to reshape China and eventually the world in his image. While the Chinese Communist Party was always a repressive authoritarian organization, under Xi the party has not only ramped up its authoritarianism, it started to export it to other countries, but more on that later. Shortly after taking office, Xi undertook a massive anti-corruption campaign across both the Chinese government and the military. While China did in fact suffer from a massive corruption problem, ranking among the most corrupt in the developed world at the time, the truth is that Xi's purge wasn't just to root out criminal politicians and military leaders, it was to weed out anyone who might pose a challenge to his authority. It's no surprise then, as Xi sent back thousands to prison, he began to lay the groundwork for removing presidential term limits. In 2018, he accomplished that goal, when the Communist Party, staffed almost completely with Xi loyalists, voted to remove presidential term limits from the constitution. But ruling China isn't enough for the CCP. To ensure their own survival, they need to topple the liberal globe order modeled on Western democracies, and China's got two plans to do just that. The first is the most direct and simple approach, and it starts off right on their own shores. China's ambitions to become the world's reigning superpower will never come to pass if it can't first topple the current reigning world superpower, the United States of America. In order to achieve this, it first must kick the US out of the Pacific for good, and that means building a strong navy. Navies need soldiers though, and to that end, China is preparing its people and the world for war against the United States. Since the late 2010s, a slew of Chinese action films have been released globally, featuring Chinese heroes who inevitably end up fighting against corrupt American villains. Meanwhile, China threatens to blacklist any films that feature Chinese villains, as US producers discovered in 2012 when the Red Dawn remake was forced to undergo extensive reshoots and editing to change a plausible Chinese invasion of America into an unrealistic invasion by North Korean troops. China has never been able to challenge even just the US Navy's Pacific forces, never mind the entire might of the American Navy. But in the last 10 years, China's ability to challenge the US Navy has dramatically increased, with capabilities that it could only dream of when first Xi took power. First, China has developed a massive ballistic missile force, the largest in the world. So large, in fact, it's now officially its own branch of the Chinese military, the Chinese Liberation Army Rocket Force. The nation might still lag behind the United States when it comes to long-range targeting capabilities, but they have proven that they have the capability of hitting a mobile target far from their own shores, at least in testing. Under kinetic and electronic attack, it's not known how well the inexperienced Chinese military will actually perform. And that is key when considering discussing Chinese military might. For all their improvements in modernizing their forces and expanding capabilities, China is still a completely inexperienced military which has not fought a modern war. The last conflict it fought against Vietnam in the 70s was a humiliating affair even after Vietnam had been severely weakened by its long war against the US. Vietnam ended up fighting the Chinese to a standstill, and though China claimed victory, it was Chinese troops who ended up being forced to retreat back over the border. A lack of experience in modern combined arms warfare is a serious deficiency in Chinese forces, and the nation didn't even have a joint command structure until only recently, meaning that its different branches of the military had no way of working together in a combat scenario. The US, for instance, has a long tradition of joint command operations, allowing it to seamlessly integrate its various branches into a unified fighting force. Another critical deficiency for China is a lack of realistic training for its combat troops, though this too has begun to slowly improve over time. For much of its modern history, China's military would only undertake exercises that were rehearsed in advance and designed to make the military look good, while providing little if any actual training benefit. Chinese missiles aim to level the playing field against the vastly more experienced and capable US military, which has a robust training schedule for both its active duty and reserves, and is one of the most experienced militaries in the world. A missile doesn't need to be trained, and a salvo of missiles can quickly level the playing field. Thus, the PLARF is a serious threat to the United States Navy. Their missiles have steadily become more accurate, with the DF-3A long-range ballistic missile initially having a miss radius of 4,000 meters, and today one of only a few hundred meters. That's far from pinpoint accuracy, but if you're using nuclear weapons or a large enough number of missiles, accuracy is largely irrelevant, even against a moving carrier strike group. And China definitely has the missiles to spare, with approximately 2,200 long-range conventional ballistic missiles ready to engage the US Navy all the way across the Pacific, nearly to Hawaii. China has enough missiles to target every vessel in the US Pacific Command and overwhelm its anti-missile defenses. What's unknown, though, is how well the PLARF would operate in a contested contested environment against U.S. kinetic, electronic, and cyber warfare assets. In order for a missile to strike its target, a long kill chain of assets must be protected from destruction or harassment. And the further away the target, the more vulnerable and critical this kill chain becomes. These kill chains can be aerial surveillance assets, satellites in space, ground and airborne radar, and all important data links, which must be protected from enemy attack and degradation. It's unknown how well China can defend its kill chains to ensure the rocket force can keep the U.S. Navy out of the Pacific. But striking against its highest priority target doesn't require a very long kill chain. Thousands of China's missiles are aimed at the first stepping stone in China's ascension to dominate the world, Taiwan. This breakaway republic used to be Chinese territory until after World War II, when the Nationalist Party retreated to the island from the Communists. Initially a dictatorship, Taiwan grew ties with the United States and changed to a liberal democracy. But that democracy is only 100 miles offshore from a communist dictatorship that very much wants it back in the fold. For China, reclaiming Taiwan is of critical importance. For starters, the continued independence of the island nation is a thorn in the side of the Chinese Communist Party. Its liberal democracy is a direct challenge to Xi Jinping's authoritarian dictatorship, and sets an example that a growing number of young Chinese are eager to follow. This is a threat to the CCP's survival, as the last thing that the party wants is the Chinese people getting silly ideas like voting rights or free speech in their head. To counter Taiwan's influence, a robust censorship campaign targets and eliminates any pro-Taiwan or pro-democracy content on China's state-run social media. In China, this photo is illegal, and posting it can get you sent to jail. Mentioning the 1989 government slaughter of up to 4,000 student pro-democracy protesters in Tiananmen Square is a good way to end up in prison for years. The image and the history of the slaughter are censored across all forms of Chinese media. For years, China has promised Taiwan that it would still be allowed to rule itself after reunification, under its vaunted One Nation, Two Systems program that was implemented in Hong Kong after the handover by the British to the Chinese. One Nation, Two Systems was supposed to ensure that the people of Hong Kong would continue to enjoy their democratic freedoms and independence for 50 years after the British handover. But just between 1997 and 2007, 218 cases of breaching the rights of Hong Kong citizens were verified. Today, Beijing barely tries to hide its influence over Hong Kong as it intimidates critics, infiltrates the Hong Kong government with politicians it buys and pays for, and even uses the local police forces against protesters who wish for democracy. In 2019, Xi Jinping once more offered Taiwan a one-country, two-systems deal if it reunified with China, which Taiwan immediately and completely rejected. Given how China has treated Hong Kong, it's difficult not to see why Taiwan's president so quickly and thoroughly dismissed any idea of being lured back into the Chinese fold with the lie of one country, two systems. Taiwan knows that once China has a foothold on its island, the democratic rights and freedoms it's enjoyed for generations are over. Taiwan's independence, however, is more than just a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's future. It's also a major military embarrassment for a country that wishes to be seen as a superpower. The definition of a superpower is a nation which can project its cultural, economic, and political and military power across the entire planet, a role that currently only the United States can fulfill. If China can't even bring an island nation of 100 miles off of its coast to a heel, how is it supposed to project its military or political power globally? As long as Taiwan remains independent, it'll prove to the world that China's incapable of projecting military or political power even just off its own shores, and thus Taiwan must fall if China is to rise. Whether it happens peacefully with reunification or under armed invasion remains to be seen, but recent polls showed that over 90% of Taiwanese supported continued independence. Retaking Taiwan, though, also gives the Chinese military the breathing room necessary to kick the United States out of the Pacific for good. From Taiwan, the Chinese Navy and Air Force both would have a strategic high ground in the Pacific, so to speak, from which to defend the Chinese coast. As long as Taiwan remains closely aligned with the United States, China can't break out of what's known as the First Island Chain, an invisible line that runs from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines. Today, there's no chance Taiwan is going to reunite with China, and the Chinese Navy can't pull off a cross-strait invasion of the island nation. But all that is changing, as the People's Liberation Navy slowly but steadily expands its inventory of amphibious assault ships and landing craft. In another few years' time, it's believed that China will have the necessary hardware to pull off a successful invasion, if they can keep the U.S. air and naval power at bay. To that end, China has greatly expanded the size of its navy, with 355 ships, 145 of which are major surface combatants. It's now the numerically largest navy in the world, and many of its destroyers are more modern than aging U.S. counterparts, though they don't pack as big of a punch with fewer missile cells per ship than the United States. Xi Jinping is dedicated to fully modernizing the Chinese military and fielding a world-class force by 2049, in time for the CCP's 100th anniversary, so the size and capabilities of the Chinese Navy will only continue growing. To To counter this threat, the United States has undertaken a renewed shipbuilding program and accelerated the procurement of new classes of destroyers, submarines, and even aircraft carriers. However, the U.S. has commitments all over the world, while China can focus the entirety of its forces on just one opponent, the United States. This is a major strategic problem for America in a future showdown with China, but the U.S. has one big advantage that China lacks: allies. So it turns out authoritarianism is not a popular choice with most people, and acting like a regional bully isn't conducive to making friends. At the moment, China has no regional allies and few friends of any influence. Even its closest neighbors, for the moment, prefer to partner with the US than China. But this is where part 2 of China's plan to dominate the world comes to play: soft power. In order to push the United States out of the Pacific, China must wield enough economic and political power over its neighbors that it's able to force them under its influence and out of the US's. To that end, China has launched a multi-pronged offensive on its regional neighbors that includes charm, appeasement, political manipulation, and even outright economic coercion. Beijing's charm offensive has never worked out the way it hoped, and in fact ended up driving Australia even closer to the United States, to the point that the nation has now joined a trilateral pact with the US and UK to defend the Pacific. When Australia joined the United States in calling out China for its human rights abuses and genocide of the Uyghur people, China responded by economically punishing Australia, putting harsh tariffs on Australian goods, and resorting to outright sanctions. In response to these actions, a Chinese official said, "We'll not allow any country to reap benefits from doing business with China," while groundlessly accusing and smearing China and undermining China's core interests based on ideology. The smear that insulted Beijing, Australia condemning the nation for photos like this, captured using a drone and smuggled out of the country, with a long history of chemically castrating Muslim minorities in its western provinces, separating families, imprisoning tens of thousands without a cause, and forcing Uyghur women to have abortions and undergo sterilization. China has rightly earned international condemnation for human rights abuses. The nation claims it's simply fighting extremism. The truth is, it's carrying out a quiet genocide, and an estimated million are already dead. But while Australia didn't bow to China's pressure to remain quiet on its human rights abuses and toe the Chinese Communist Party line, other small nations have, because they have no choice. For nearly a decade now, China has undertaken its Belt and Road Initiative. The modern Silk Road is meant to improve China's access to international markets by building infrastructure both at home and abroad. The biggest beneficiaries have been smaller, less developed nations whom have received loans from the Chinese government to build much-needed infrastructure with Chinese firms, of course. But the problems come when the loans come due, as these generous loans provided by China often have outrageous repayment terms that China knew the host nation would never be able to adhere to, despite the promise of greatly increased economic activity. In most of these places, that promised economic boon never came, and so nation after nation has defaulted on these loans. Unable to repay, the countries have been forced to cede entire airports, shipyards, and railways to the Chinese government, giving up ownership entirely. China's Belt and Road Initiative has thus been retermed as modern colonialism, with China at the helm. But with most underdeveloped nations, the allure of Chinese economic prosperity will entice them to agree to just about anything Beijing offers, or commands of them. It's no surprise that many of these nations suddenly find their government filled with pro-China yes-men and importing tens of millions of dollars of surveillance technology. Along with Chinese infrastructure, all too often comes Chinese style of government, and the Chinese Communist Party has been all too glad to export its form of authoritarianism to the world, and how to maintain a modern surveillance state. With exports to over 60 nations, Huawei has become the global leader in exporting surveillance tech, with China even building entire surveillance networks for host countries. Slowly but surely, China is changing governments around the world, and the US is inadvertently helping it. Under the Trump administration, the United States stepped back from its role as a global leader. This vacuum of power was quickly exploited by China, who was happy to infiltrate international economic and political organizations left reeling after a retreat from the United States. Due to ambiguity over the US's willingness to defend traditional Western values of liberal democracy and open markets, nations caught between a powerful authoritarian neighbor such as China and a desire for liberal freedoms found themselves questioning if it was politically survivable to continue to oppose the desires of their more powerful dictator next door. This was most obvious across the South Pacific, as nations such as Vietnam and Thailand were suddenly forced to consider the possibility that they may no longer count on US support to fend off Chinese political or military aggression. But the failure of the Trump administration to fill even basic State Department positions, hundreds of them, for over a year, was another blunder that China was happy to exploit, sending its diplomats all over the world. With no American presence on the ground, nations even as close to home as Suriname in South America turned to Chinese interests. Now, for the first time since the end of the 19th century, the United States faces growing influence of a major rival in its own backyard. If China gained a foothold in South America, it would be the first first time since the 19th century that any rival power has had a presence in the Western Hemisphere. This is as intolerable to the United States today as it was in the 18th century when it removed Spain as the last European power with any influence in the US's side of the world. This is a strategic victory for America that no other nation on Earth has ever enjoyed, as it allows the United States to maintain a forward presence with its military around the world, capable of quickly responding to aggression from any bad actor. If China gains a political and military foothold in South America, the United States will be forced to reel in some of its forces for homeland defense, severely weakening its place on the global stage. If the United States is to prevent China's ascension to global domination, it must once more take up the reins of a global leadership and cease its retreat from the world stage. Thankfully, while still too early to tell, it appears that a new American administration has dramatically changed course. However, China's growing economic influence is not something so easily countered, even if African and Middle East nations are growing increasingly aware of the exploitative nature of the Belt and Road Initiative. The same can be said about China's growing military might, with Taiwan finding itself in the difficult position of resisting a growing giant on its doorstep while unsure if the United States will really defend it or not. And as the US continues to hesitate on the global stage, the rest of the world is starting to have to ask itself the same question. Is it better just to appease the Chinese Communist Party or run the risk of becoming its next victim? Can you imagine an official edict telling you that you must kill your beloved dog? Or what about getting interrogated by the secret police just because you like a certain type of flower? It's happened in China, and you'll soon know why. But first, no porn please, we're Chinese. November 2021, police in Shanghai were knocking down the door of a 38-year-old man while he was frantically deleting files from his laptop and phone. Pornographic movies were on those devices, and in China, that's a big no-no. The man was actually an award-winning movie director named Shen Juhui. His media company had fallen on hard times during the pandemic, and so he decided to try his hand at making porn movies. According to media reports, for each film he made around 30,000 yuan, but since he'd started his enterprise, he got around 1 million yuan. He made that in the space of a year, so as ventures go, making porn wasn't too bad. He did actually manage to get rid of much of the evidence, but the cops found details about shooting costs on one of his devices. One of the actresses told the cops that she'd only agreed to take part in the movies if the director agreed that he'd only release them outside of China. But of course, they managed to make their way into China. In fact, the police found out about them because the mother of a 12-year-old boy had found porn files on his laptop and gone to the cops to complain. The kid wasn't arrested, or at least in the reports they don't say he was, but we find some other reports which said some Chinese people had been arrested for merely watching porn. To do that, they had to use a VPN to get around China's infamous Great Firewall. So you have to ask, why is China so down on porn when in most countries it's accepted, if not frowned upon, by some parts of society? It's actually been illegal in the country for decades, with the main reason being the communist government says it wants to protect minors and maintain public morality. It doesn't mean people don't make homemade porn or watch it. All you pornography aficionados out there will still know there is a lot of Chinese porn available online. Still, if you are found to be making it, you could get into trouble. As for just watching it, most Chinese people wouldn't worry too much about getting that knock on the door. One Chinese man was asked online about the consumption of porn in his country, and he replied, "If you just watch some sex, take it easy. As long as you don't spread it and download it too much, nothing. Yeah, nothing will happen to you. And my roommate has 5 gigs of these movies to watch at night. This next bit of information could save your life one day. Cross at your own risk." In most countries in Europe and North America, if you see a pedestrian crossing the road, sometimes it's on what's called a zebra crossing. You kind of expect cars to yield. Not so much in some countries in Asia. For instance, if you've ever been to Thailand and you think you can just walk over a zebra crossing and everyone will stop, you could end up being one of those tourists killed in Thailand statistics. Looking at forums, it seems there are a lot of foreigners asking why this is also practiced in China. Cars just don't stop, even though those black and white blocks seem to suggest they should. One American writing about this said, "After living in China for 5 years, I've grown annoyed with this behavior, so now I cross the street and avoid eye contact with the driver. This guy has a death wish, and we really don't suggest you follow in his tracks when you're in China. They might just be bloodied tracks." There are a lot of cultural reasons why some people won't stop at zebra crossings in the country, but we actually found a website that stated drivers in Beijing are forbidden to stop at pedestrian crossings or they risk a 5 RMB fine. We looked into this because, to be honest, we were skeptical about this so-called law. Thankfully, we actually found a website that published the traffic laws for Beijing province. Article 40 of the law does say this: when the lane is rather free and the visibility is good, motor vehicles shall keep on passing through the road at high speed in accordance with the provisions of the road traffic safety laws and regulations, and shall not hinder the passing of vehicles behind. But that doesn't mean cars should keep on going if they see a person. In fact, Article 92 says cars should give way to pedestrians. So in conclusion, even though some people have said by by law, Chinese drivers won't stop or even slow down for a pedestrian. It's just an unwritten informal rule. Bear that in mind the next time you travel to China. Here's some advice from a Chinese travel website. Even at pedestrian crossings, traffic often doesn't slow down, even if you start walking across. Some will even speed up to show you that they want to go first. This next one will surprise you all. The government owns all the land. In China, you can't actually own land. You can own a house on the land, but the land is the property of the government or the property of a collective. Under the property rights law, you can get a lease on the land, and that could last 70 years and then be renewed. If you sell the house, that lease is then transferred to the new owner. To make this clearer, here's what a Chinese landlord said about owning property in China. You can't own land, but you can own a land use right. Once you have a land use right, you can sell it on the open market to whoever wants it, and the land use right is good for 70 years. No one is quite sure what happens once the land use right expires. He also talked about something interesting, and that was why China has so many so-called ghost cities. In China, you might come across lots and lots of buildings that are empty. The reason is, if you win the right to build on some land, the government wants you to build on it within 2 years, or you will lose the right. The thing is, some of the developers seem to have been hasty and the properties have stayed empty. Alright, so now back to the weird and wonderful. Don't eat that! In 2020, news reports surfaced that said the Chinese government was in the process of a big crackdown on the crime of making videos of yourself eating stuff. Yep, Chinese folks who turned into social media influencers by way of eating were apparently not to the taste of the communist government. The types of videos were something that originated in Korea, and there they got the name mukbang, which translates in English as eating broadcast. The BBC reported that the government wanted to outlaw food broadcasts in the country. Apparently, President Xi Jinping was upset about seeing Chinese citizens waste food in those videos. The BBC wrote, anyone searching for terms such as eating show or eating live stream is now being served with warning notices. The main reason, again, is because the government saw such videos as breaching China's good morals laws. Some members of the public have called the videos wasteful and vulgar, especially when the eaters try and scoff down as much food as possible in a short amount of time, which is a pretty popular kind of video right now in the US and the UK. As you'll now see, eating animals typically kept as pets is also becoming unlawful in some parts of China. Don't eat that! Part 2. During Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward, millions upon millions of people died during a terrible famine. In the disturbing book Mao's Great Famine, author Frank Decoder talks about what people resorted to back then. After going through the Chinese archives, he discovered that folks ate tree bark. They sometimes ate each other. They often tried to eat leather after boiling it. These were harsh times indeed. So you won't be surprised to hear that pets were fair game. Eating cats and dogs wasn't uncommon, and still today, some folks in China might be partial to a bit of grilled poodle. But in 2020, news reports stated that Shenzhen became the first city in China to ban the eating of cats and dogs. The city said it had done so in line with the spirit of human civilization. Animal rights activists across the world were happy about this, saying it could become a trend. Still, one of them told the BBC that in China today, about 10 million dogs and 4 million cats are killed for food every year. But don't go thinking everyone's on board with this in China. Most people are in fact very much dead against it. In a survey taken in 2015, 70 to 80% of Chinese respondents said eating cats and dogs was totally acceptable. This next one is out of this world. Say yes to drugs. Like many countries these days, China has a lot of anti-smoking campaigns going on in various parts of the country. But in 2009, Reuters reports that in a place called Gong'an County in Hubei province, the local government had issued an order to make officials smoke at least 23,000 cigarettes per year. Yep, you heard that right. The reason was to stimulate the local economy, saying that the brand of smokes had to be locally made. Reuters explained those who failed to meet their smoking targets or were caught smoking brands from other provinces would have been fined. Not surprisingly, there was a bit of an uproar about the smoking quota, so as soon as the law went into action, the local government rescinded it. Say yes to more drugs. In 2009, the New York Times wrote about something similar to the cigarette quota, which, as you know, really annoyed a lot of Chinese people. So when officials in Hanchuan, also in Hubei province, created a law to drink more booze, it was also decried by many folks in China. In this law, state workers had to meet a quota of drinking a kind of liquor known as baijiu. Again, the government wanted people to only drink the kind of baijiu made locally. They said that at least $300,000 of the stuff needed to be consumed in a year, which the Times said would have meant every adult drinking 3 bottles a day, enough to cause liver damage over time. Yet again, the government rescinded the rule after many Chinese citizens criticized it. What else could they force the people to do? The answer? Travel. Forced travel plans. In Guizhou province in the south of China, government officials wanted to report inflated numbers of tourists visiting a certain tourist hotspot. To do this, they ordered all state workers to visit that place, which was apparently some some ancient ruins. These weren't easy to get to, though, with the news report saying workers had to take a number of buses, after which they had to travel down dirt roads on the backs of motorcycles. Guizhou Commercial News reported that so many employees had to do that trip that at times government offices were totally empty. One thing you have to remember when trying to understand this is that when you live in a collective kind of society, you're expected to do your bit. This was sometimes disastrous in the past when local officials were trying to please the Communist Party hierarchy. As you'll now see, even in modern times, some local bigwigs have gone way too far. Kill all dogs. In what was also a temporary law that was heavily criticized in China, one municipality one day ordered that all dogs had to be killed. This happened in Heihei, which is in Heilongjiang province on the border with Russia. The New York Times said, though unconfirmed, the probable reason for the canine cull might have been because an official getting bitten while he was out on a walk. He was fearful of getting rabies, so it was decided it was time to exterminate all the dogs. The Times wrote, town leaders organized teams of police officers and ordered them to beat to death any dog who ventured into a public space. Obviously, this did not go down well with many of the dog lovers in China. One person talking on a radio show about the order said, "When we need to walk our dogs now, we have to first go out and look for cops." The phrase, "you couldn't make this up," springs to mind, but according to the China Daily website, it was 100% true. It reported that if people were found with dogs, very much alive dogs, they ran the risk of being fined 200 yuan. This caused an outcry all over China, but the government fought back, saying there were too many people getting bitten by dogs, and there was way too much dog poop on the streets. One official said, "We are very worried that if the dog situation gets out of control, it could hurt the city's name." Nonetheless, China's animal rights activists and the country's dog lovers won in the end, and the ban was repealed. This next one is just as strange. Only virgins, please. Experts say that in parts of China we might call the boondocks, some officials are way out of touch with modern times. Thankfully, when these overzealous officials instate a ridiculous law, public outcry often makes them change their minds. Such was the case in the municipality of Chongqing in southwest China when officials created a chastity law for women. We can't find much information about it, but it seems the local government was saying that if unmarried women weren't proved to be virgins, they couldn't make a compensation claim on the land that had been appropriated by the government. The news media simply said that non-virgins didn't deserve money. At least this next one might make some sense. What's in a name? We found quite a few reports over the last few years that talked about government officials banning the use of foreign names for buildings. Some of those names were said to be too exotic and not Chinese enough, such as calling a place Venice, which might sound cool, but apparently it is not Chinese enough. In some parts of China, the government said using such foreign names is damaging the country's sovereignty and the ethnic unity and social stability. In the city of Zhengzhou in central China's Henan province, the local government announced it was time to change a few names. It said a commercial square called Manhattan had to go, as did two residential buildings named Province and Venice. Chinese government officials said names such as those were over-the-top, West-worshipping, weird, and duplicative. Now you get to see government paranoia at its most frantic. Don't you even dare mention this flower. In 2011, the Communist Party started a ban on one of China's most cherished flowers, the jasmine flower. It didn't even want people saying the word jasmine. And this is in a country where people are used to seeing jasmine everywhere, including in their tea. The clampdown on jasmine stemmed from the pro-democracy movement in Tunisia, which got the name the Jasmine Revolution. China's state officials didn't want anything like that happening in China, so they went through the web blocking the word jasmine. They then started banning the sale of the flower in certain markets in the country, even though many people made their money selling jasmine. Prices dropped, so jasmine sellers were out of cash. One of them told the New York Times that he never even heard of the revolution in Tunisia, and he said, "I don't know anything about politics, I don't have much time to watch television." The ban was still somewhat secretive, with Beijing's Public Security Bureau not wanting to talk about it. Still, many folks whose lives involved the flower reported that they'd received a visit from the cops. One woman said she'd been made to attend a meeting in which she and others were told to stay away from jasmine. She was also told to report the license plates of any cars whose occupants had come to the market to buy some of the flowers. Since all this was shrouded in secrecy, no one really knew what the jasmine thing was all about. A jasmine seller at the Zhuzhou Flower and Plant Trading Center in Beijing said she'd been told that the crackdown was something to do with Japanese radiation contamination. Another woman who sold the flowers not far from the US Embassy had been told it was related to poison. And we think that is significant proof of government overreach. UFOs are in the news like never before. The official Pentagon investigation has revealed that while it has not found any definitive evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, it has confirmed that a number of objects spotted by military witnesses were metallic and solid. Recently, whistleblower David Grush dropped a bombshell allegation that the U.S. has been running a UFO recovery program in secret since the end of the Second World War. And unlike other people to make that claim before him, Grush brought the receipts, informing the Congressional Intelligence Committee in a classified meeting where to look and who to ask. But UFOs are a global phenomenon, and China has been no stranger to these unexplained sightings. Under the iron fist of the Chinese Communist Party, independent UFO investigation has been difficult, and the government has not been very open with its own investigation into the matter. However, some UFO events were so huge that not even the CCP could keep them under wraps. It's perhaps China's most famous UFO event, and it would take place over the course of over 20 years, with evidence that even hardcore skeptics have found difficult to dismiss. It all started in June of 1994 with a remote mountain village far from China's bustling cities. This was a time when China was just starting to experience the start of the economic miracle which would reshape it from a second world power to a near-peer competitor to the United States. Most people still lived in the rural countryside, and education outside of the big cities was scarce if not rare. A local lumberjack, Meng Xiaoguo, reported spotting a strange object on a nearby mountainside. The object shimmered with some light, and Meng initially thought that it was an airplane or perhaps a helicopter crash of some sort. Hoping to scavenge some of the wreckage, Meng made his way toward the object. As he neared the object, but before being able to tell what it truly was, Meng stated that he felt as if something struck him in the forehead, causing him to lose consciousness. The next thing Meng remembers is regaining consciousness back at his home, with no memory of how he trekked all the way back to his village from the mountainside. With the object no longer in sight, Meng quickly forgot about it and went back to his normal life. However, a few days after seeing the strange object, Meng stated that he woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. He was floating above his bed with his wife still asleep next to it, and to his terror he saw a creature enter his home through a solid wall. This creature stood about 10 feet tall and was humanoid in shape, but with 6 fingers on each hand and thighs covered in braided hair. Meng could tell it was female, and the creature approached him as he laid there helplessly. This creature very briefly had sex with him, with Meng stated it only lasted for a few seconds before it vanished once again through the wall and he floated back down onto his bed. Days after this nighttime visit, Meng claimed that the aliens returned and at one point brought him inside of their ship. There, a group of the tall beings began to speak to him in broken Chinese, which made it difficult for him to understand them. The aliens spoke with Meng about themselves but were cagey about giving specific details. They stated that they were refugees who were fleeing a dying home, though if they were escaping a planet that was physically dying or simply a social situation they didn't like remains unknown due to the strange wording the creatures used. Meng asked about the female alien that he had a sexual encounter with, but the creatures told him that it would be impossible for him to see her now, instead telling him, quote, "In 60 years on a distant planet, the son of a Chinese peasant will be born." Before returning him to his home, the aliens also showed Meng a strange recording, and one that would make this a very difficult case to explain. On a monitor of some sort, the aliens showed Meng a giant planet with a comet smashing into it. They explained that this was a recording of a comet striking the planet Jupiter right here in the solar system. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 would indeed strike Jupiter on July 16th, the day Meng was shown the supposed recording, breaking up into pieces that would rain down until July 20th. 22 years later, Meng claimed that the aliens returned to visit him once more and presented him with a piece of that comet. That piece of rock would end up complicating Meng's case decades after it had been forgotten, when it was discovered to be rich in terbium, a rare earth mineral common in the asteroid belt. Meng's story would set off a media frenzy, and this would significantly complicate the act of trying to piece together the original story with published accounts. For example, some reports state that Meng went to see the alien ship with 30 other men before he was struck unconscious, and they brought him home. Another early report states that Meng went to find the ship with his niece's husband. One report stated that the sexual encounter between Meng and the alien lasted 40 minutes, while Meng himself claimed in 2021 it only lasted a few seconds. What we do know is that the incident prompted many Chinese UFO groups to make the trip to Meng's remote village to investigate the story themselves. They discovered scorch marks on surrounding trees as well as rocks split into pieces where Meng claimed the ship had originally landed. Wang Fengchen, first chairman of the Beijing UFO Research Organization, suggested that it appeared as if an aircraft had landed and took off again, though there was no indication it was alien in nature. An investigation of Meng's home revealed a troubling result. According to Wang, A researcher from the Chinese Academy of Sciences used a Geiger counter to measure radiation in Meng's home. When the instrument was brought close to the wall Meng claimed the alien had passed through, the instrument went haywire. No amount of troubleshooting could explain the instrument's response. Initial reactions varied on Meng's story, even within the UFO investigative community itself. A Secretary General of the Beijing UFO Research Organization claimed that Meng had no credibility and that local leaders claimed he was mad. Lots of people who already wanted to believe him were led astray by Meng upon encountering them, claimed the former Secretary General. Meng, though, would pass a polygraph test when asked to take one. Administered by local police, the test showed no sign of deception from Meng as he retold his story. However, polygraph tests aren't foolproof and thus remain inadmissible in court in most countries. The more difficult aspect of Meng's story to explain is his claim that he saw a video of a comet striking Jupiter. The event was relatively unknown to most people even as it was happening until newspapers ran front-page photos of the comet impacts picked up by the Hubble telescope. How did a remote villager in China's undeveloped countryside know of a comet impact on the solar system's largest planet? It's not an easy question to answer, especially without knowing more about the initial investigation, having a clearer timeline of Meng's encounters, and what kind of exposure Meng might have had to the academic community. When Meng revealed he'd been gifted a part of that comet by the same aliens in 2016, he reignited debates over his encounter. The large rock was analyzed by scientists who were shocked to discover it contained large concentrations of terbium, a rare earth mineral. It's unfortunate that those scientists' report is not available to Western readers as it's unknown what concentration the terbium was discovered in. Some of the richest terbium deposits on Earth come from China's clays, where it rests at a concentration of about 1%. However, terbium is also abundant in the asteroid belt, complicating the effort to explain it away as a simple rock this Chinese peasant happened to pick up. And if it was a simple rock he picked up, then this peasant with little education just happened to pick one up that was impossible to explain away as terrestrial. But then there's the description of the aliens that Meng gave. In 2015, Meng was visited by a reporter working for the Huffington Post, who asked him to sketch an alien that he allegedly had a sexual encounter with. The reporter realized that Meng was drawing something very similar to the Michelin Man mascot, albeit with a lot of hair. A local auto repair shop had a Michelin Man face on a sign placed on its roof. Meng's story is difficult to explain and raises questions for both believers and skeptics. The wall Meng claimed the alien had passed through did seem to give off lingering radiation, and something had set fire to vegetation and cracked rocks at the spot Meng claimed he saw the ship. But at the same time, Meng's aliens bore a striking resemblance to a corporate mascot who happened to be prominently featured on a nearby sign. Meng's rock, which he claims is a piece of the comet that crashed into Jupiter, is rich in a rare earth mineral that's most commonly found in China's clays, but in extremely low concentrations. And that same mineral happens to be abundant in some celestial rocky bodies. We also know that Comet Shoemaker-Levy broke up into many pieces in its death spiral before slamming into Jupiter. Without access to the original investigation documents, including those from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, it's impossible to draw a conclusion about this case. But we do know that China is taking the UAP-UFO phenomenon very seriously, and unlike the United States, it has refused to comment. The People's Liberation Army has its own UFO investigation group and refers to UAPs as unidentified air conditions. However, the only thing the public has been able to learn from the military investigation is that reports of UAP activity amongst the Chinese military appears to be on the rise. It's also known that the staggering number of reports has forced the Chinese investigation to turn to artificial intelligence to help process the raw data. Like in similar investigations in the United States and Russia, the Chinese Academy of Sciences believes that most UFOs are misidentified natural or man-made phenomenon. However, Chinese investigations seem to be unable to account for a percentage of sightings which seem to evade rational explanation. This too mirrors both the American and Russian investigations into the phenomenon. Some of these sightings have a large number of witnesses, making them difficult to dispel. In February 14th of this year, residents in the city of Qiqihar in the province of Heilongjiang reported spotting a strange light in the sky. The object moved along the sky and left a fiery trail behind it, disappearing after a few seconds. The Qiqihar Meteorological Bureau said it had not been notified of any military activity in the area and could not explain the briefly appearing fiery light that seemed to disappear just as fast. At 9 p.m. on August 20, 2011, air crews from dozens of aircraft flying over Shanghai witnessed a massive glowing sphere in the sky which seemed to pulsate. Skeptics claimed that it was likely caused by a bubble of diffused rocket fuel outside the atmosphere, but witnesses were not satisfied with that answer, claiming the object was solid. The UFO was also spotted by observers in Beijing who witnessed it appear as a giant white ball of light before slowly disappearing. Answers ranged from rocket fuel in the upper atmosphere to unknown military satellite activities, but with no similar events recorded by other space agencies, the true cause remains unknown. UFOs are not a modern phenomenon for the world's oldest civilization. All the way back in 1071, the poet Su Dong Po wrote about a UFO he spotted while staying overnight in Zhengshan Temple in Zhenjiang. In 1892, painter Wu Youru produced a painting from an incident observed by himself in the local community. Called Red Flame Soaring in the Sky, the painting illustrates a burning ball crossing the sky while onlookers stare in awe from a bridge. UFOs seem to take as keen an interest in China as elsewhere in the world, and disturbingly the same phenomenon reported elsewhere was being reported in China. On March 18, 1991, at 6 p.m., the crew of Flight 3665, flying from Shanghai to Jinan, observed a spheroidal UFO that disassembled itself into a single sphere and various cylinders, then reassembled into one solid craft once more. The conversation between the ground crew and the aircraft was recorded as the crew described the craft's color changing from red to black as it reformed itself. UFOs would also shut down numerous Chinese airports throughout the years. In 2010, UFOs shut down an airport in Hangzhou in Inner Mongolia as flight crews reported seeing luminescent craft in the sky above the airport. Later that year, an airport in Chongqing would get its own visit. Unfortunately, the People's Republic of China's authoritarian and restrictive culture has made investigation of the UFO phenomenon difficult for both local and foreign researchers. China's Cold War history with UFOs is largely unknown, with the PRC adopting an extremely conservative attitude toward the UFO phenomenon until only recently. While the Shanghai UFO Research Center was founded in 1979, it was only legally registered in 2005, an indication of how long people in China have had to wait for the government to loosen up its attitude toward the UFO phenomenon. That's not to say that the PRC is being candid with its modern UFO investigation or even the history of the People's Liberation Army and UFOs, with rumors circulating that UFOs have shown particular aggression towards Chinese attempts to intercept or down them. There is no doubt that China is one of the most powerful countries in the world today. To some, China's rise to power has been nerve-wracking. Yet China has always been powerful and influential. And in the grand scheme of human history, China being an economic and cultural powerhouse has actually been the norm. So let's take a look at the evolution of China and why it may be on track to be the world's next #1 superpower. If you want to understand why things are the way they are today, you have to understand the past. The Chinese culture is one of the oldest in the world. And like today, the ancient Chinese were builders. Construction projects on a massive scale are being built right now, putting millions of Chinese citizens to work. And over 2,000 years ago, China was doing the same thing, although there was definitely more slave labor being used in the past. One of the most famous construction projects of ancient times started at the beginning of Chinese history. Qin Shi Huangdi had unified much of the Chinese heartland between 221 and 206 BC, and it was during that time that construction began on the first Great Wall of China. The period following Qin Shi Huangdi's rule was considered the first golden age of the region. Between 206 BC and 220 AD, China saw huge leaps in economic growth and its cultural spread. Approximately 400 years later, a relatively short time in the scheme of things, the second golden age of China began, and it extended its sphere of influence all the way into Central Asia. Just like with all empires, change in power was something to be expected. By the 13th century, the Mongols had conquered China and united much of the country under their rule. During this time, Beijing became the capital, and Westerners such as Marco Polo visited the country. This marked the starting point of contact between China and the West, which eventually evolved into prosperous trading relationships and the exchange of ideas, but also led to death and destruction when the Mongols swept across the Asian continent and invaded Europe. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Mongols and took control of the country, and China moved away from warfare and conquest to start focusing on the country itself. China's economy ramped up due to high agricultural output. The bureaucracy and military were centralized, and the Great Wall of China was completed. We often forget that when learning about other countries, we're taught about them through the lens of our own culture. For people living in the Western world, the history curriculum in school rarely touches on the achievements or cultures of Asian countries. Make no mistake, just because China's early power and influence aren't often taught or talked about, That doesn't mean they didn't happen. China's past was full of advancements and economic growth, something that continues to this day. We know of Chinese influences in the ancient past from written records and archaeological data. As we move closer to the present, we have even more information about the chain of events which led to China becoming one of the most powerful nations on the planet. By the 19th century, Western powers had colonized many parts of the world, including Asia. China had been in a long decline, and the unequal treaties negotiated by European powers had crippled the Chinese economy even further. This led to the destabilization of the government, allowing regional warlords to rise to power. During the 19th and early 20th century, events were set in motion that would lead to modern-day China. It was a time of bloodshed and oppression in the country. Foreign intervention in the affairs of China led to the exploitation of its government and peoples, which led to massive amounts of poverty. Along with Russia and Japan, Western countries exploited China and forced the government into giving concessions while simultaneously weakening the country's ruling body. Then in 1931, Japan invaded China. Over the next decade, they occupied more and more Chinese land. In 1937, the different factions within China united to fight back against the Japanese annexation of their country. Finally, the Chinese took back their lands but immediately fell into civil war, and whoever won would rule the country. China had gone through decades of struggle to regain its land and power. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party of China, was victorious over the opposing nationalist side during the Civil War. The foundation of modern-day China had finally begun. It's essential not to forget everything that led up to this point. The idea of China's power and influence in the past are still ingrained in the country's cultural history. The memories of oppression and exploitation by the Western nations and their allies were also still fresh in the collective consciousness of the Chinese people. And the longing to return to a time where China's power and economic strength were respected was a driving force for the decisions made by the new communist government. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a 5-year economic plan that was meant to lift the Chinese people out of poverty and jumpstart the country's economy. It was supposed to collectivize farming and introduce labor-intensive industries. As with all economic plans, not everyone would benefit, and the plan ended up being a complete failure. However, the move toward revitalizing the Chinese economy persisted. Mao's follow-up plan was the Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years and changed the country's political and ideological systems. It was a way to inspire a revolutionary spirit in the people, which it did, but not in the way Mao had intended. The masses protested, causing disruptions in the economic, social, and political systems of China. This primed the country for extreme changes. When Mao died in 1976, he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. His main goal was to start China on a path to economic reform that would make the country wealthy and influential in the growing world economy. Xiaoping knew that to ramp up the economy, the country needed a healthy workforce. Population growth in China had exploded, which meant there were plenty of workers, but the resources required to support so many people were lacking. In response to this, the government imposed a one-child policy to try and curb population growth. The government also granted peasants the right to farm their own plots of land instead of relying solely on the communist distribution system. These changes resulted in improved living standards and decreased the number of food shortages. Xiaoping also started China's open door policy, which now allowed diplomatic relations to resume and foreign investments to begin within the country. It also provided other nations access to China's very large yet very cheap labor workforce. All of these things combined led to enormous amounts of money being poured into China, setting the country up to become one of the largest economies in the world. China was gaining massive amounts of wealth and influence through relations with different governments and corporations around the world. The open door policy also allowed the development of a market economy and private business sectors. But just like when wealth and growth come to any country, the average citizen does not always benefit. Corruption in the government ran rampant, and influential leaders were getting wealthy from the economic boom. But poverty and cultural shifts led to protests around China. This culminated in the Tiananmen Square massacre. International outrage led to sanctions on China, but this did not stop the economic engine that had already been set in motion. In 1989, stock markets opened in Shanghai and Shenzhen, leading to even more economic growth. 3 years later, Russia and China signed a declaration restoring cooperation between the two countries, which allowed for further economic opportunities for China. In that same year, the International Monetary Fund ranked China as the third largest economy in the world after the United States and Japan. It wouldn't be long until they moved up even further in the rankings. On October 1st, 1999, the country celebrated its 50th anniversary as the People's Republic of China. The following year, the government cracked down on corruption with public executions. Not everyone agreed with the methods of the People's Republic, but the power that they wielded allowed for swift change and few actual repercussions. In 2001, China met with Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to create the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The mission of this new alliance was to combat ethnic and religious militancy in the countries. Of even more significant benefit to China, though, was the agreement which promoted trade and investment between the countries. With economic opportunity looming around every corner, China took the next step in expanding its power and influence by joining the World Trade Organization. This allowed for negotiations with other countries to lower trade barriers and tariffs on Chinese goods. With fewer restrictions and the ability to trade worldwide more efficiently, the Chinese economy grew faster than ever. Many people still lived in poverty, though, and the government continuously turned a blind eye to unlawful working conditions. Some workers were even treated as slaves or paid an unlivable wage. This allowed Chinese companies to make and sell products at lower and lower prices while still making enormous profits. As the economy grew, more resources could be spent on other government projects like military and space programs. In 2003, China launched its first crewed spacecraft. 2 years after that, China and Russia conducted their first joint military exercises. With a powerful ally in Russia and several free trade agreements with other countries in the region, China gained more and more power. While expanding its global influence, China had also been constructing cities and internal renovation projects that created jobs and cash flow for its citizens. In 2006, China finished building the world's largest hydroelectric dam, called the Three Gorges Dam. Later that year, China met with African leaders for the China-African Summit in Beijing. Around $2 billion in business deals were agreed upon in exchange for loans and credit from China. This only furthered China's economic power and gave them leverage in the future. With the industrialization of China, its numerous large-scale construction projects, and the desire to keep its economy growing, concerns about public and environmental health had fallen to the wayside. The government acknowledged that pollution in the country had reached critical levels and that new policies would be implemented to deal with the problem. However, this did not stop the economic drive of the country. The government continued to pour money into technology and the military. China tested long-range missiles and even shot down an old weather satellite in space, showing the world that they now had missiles capable of hitting targets in orbit. In 2008, as the global economy slowed down, the Chinese government announced a $586 billion stimulus package to ensure their economic growth wouldn't stall. To secure the resources they need, China signed a $25 billion deal with Russia, making sure that the country has enough oil for the next 20 years. In 2010, China became the world's largest exporter, and the following year, China overtook Japan as the world's second-largest economy. And even after China overtook Japan, it continued to grow its economy until 2014, at which point things finally started to slow down. China's economy is still growing, but not at the incredible rate that it had been over the previous decade. Thanks to a strong economy and a government with absolute authority, China grew into one of the most powerful nations in the world. But this is not surprising, as even in the past, China was incredibly influential. They had the workforce to ramp up their economy, and once they switched from isolationist policies to joining the global economy, there was very little that could stop China's progress. The economic gains made by China did pull hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but at the expense of polluted air and unsafe working conditions. Whether your political ideology is for or against the way China runs its country, there's no denying that there were benefits from the reforms and economic policies they implemented. Education rates have gone up drastically, and it's estimated that by 2030 the same percentage of Chinese workers will have a university degree as countries in Europe have today. However, many poor rural communities in the country have low skill levels and an aging workforce, but this is also true in other economically advanced countries around the world. China became powerful by taking a different path than Western countries, and now with a thriving economy comes the ability to have a strong military and loan out money to other countries, which can be used as leverage in the future. It's no surprise that after a time of relatively low economic and cultural output during the European colonization, China would eventually return to its norm as being one of the most powerful countries in the world, a position it's held for much of its multi-thousand-year history. Large air-cushioned landing craft speed onto the hostile beach as enemy fire reaches out from defensive positions all along the rocky shoreline. Cannon and machine gun fire penetrate the rubber skirts of the LCACs, adjusting to aim up at the actual body of the craft, where it can score real casualties on the Americans. A slight buzzing noise is heard overhead, growing louder by the second. Suddenly, the Chinese positions start exploding one by one, and in desperation, the defenders shift their fire up at the sky. But the drones in the swarm are far too small to be effectively destroyed by kinetic weapons, so the defenders can't stop the terrible rain of highly maneuverable and highly precise explosives decimating their lines. Even dug-in positions are not safe, as the nimble drones simply fly through firing slits to explode inside, showering the defenders with hypersonic metal fragments. Chinese anti-drone defense weapons come online, painting the sky in swaths of electronic noise. Drones fall by the dozens, but there's hundreds more to replace them. Eventually, other specialized drones hardened against EM interference start dive-bombing the EW emitters. The swarm continues its suicidal attack unabated as the first of the Marine landing craft finally hit the beach. But as the landing ramps come down, it's not Marines or even infantry fighting vehicles that come spilling out, but rather a small horde of tracked drones, each about the size of a steamer trunk. The drone vehicles surge forward, the front line immediately falling to landmines and defensive fire. That doesn't matter much to the mindless robots, as those behind simply push forward and ahead. They run into more enemy fire and even more landmines, but in their wake leave behind a tracked path through which the Marines who will soon hit the shore can travel, largely safe from the landmines. The drones themselves now put out a steady barrage of cannon fire, firing 20mm cannons and 50 caliber machine guns. Most are destroyed, but some make it all the way to the Chinese positions where they promptly explode, leaving behind 10-foot craters and showering a large area in explosive fragments. The Marines that are now hitting the beach use the downed drones as cover, as special drone operators rapidly dispatch mini swarms of very agile drones the size of a small bird. Using virtual reality goggles, the operators guide those drones in with pinpoint accuracy, killing individual Chinese defenders. Out at sea, a Chinese task force attempts to dislodge the American amphibious assault group and end the beach landings. As the big Type 55 destroyers near anti-ship missile range, sonar operators suddenly warn of a strange sound they've never heard before. It sounds like an organic source, but dozens of them, as if a school of very large tuna suddenly turned heel and set course straight for the Chinese ships. Just 3 meters below the waves, American anti-ship drones designed like large fish and using a similar propulsion method speed toward the Chinese destroyers and the cruisers. This drone swarm numbers at 4 dozen, and it was deployed months ago before hostilities even began. The swarm lingered in the region, surfacing to use their solar cell-covered skin to recharge their internal batteries. Their strange fish-like construction made them largely invisible to traditional Chinese surveillance and early warning equipment. Now the school of deadly fish is amongst the enemy ships, the Chinese having realized the danger they were in far too late. Deck crews man machine guns and desperately fire down at the swift, dark shapes swimming through the water below them. But the man-made fish slam into the sides of the Chinese ships, detonating their anti-ship munitions and punching large holes in armored hulls. Each fish only packs about 100 pounds of high explosives, but working together in a swarm, the deadly fish soon cripple numerous Chinese vessels. Only one will sink, but the rest are mission kills, which require towing to make it back to port safely, if American submarines or surface combatants don't catch up and wipe them out first. Hundreds of miles above the Earth, the Chinese break the ultimate taboo and attack American satellites with anti-satellite weapons. These high-speed missiles slam into American military satellites in low orbit. In a few hours, they'll begin knocking out satellites in higher orbit, effectively blinding America's eyes in the sky and breaking its global communications chain. But from the launch pads in the US, half a dozen rockets speed to space. Once they're 100 miles above the atmosphere, they release their payload, hundreds of miniature satellites which quickly disperse into loose constellations. Each satellite only has a tiny payload, a small communications antenna, optical or infrared sensor, or radar surveillance receiver. However, by networking together, the vast constellations replicate the capabilities of sensors and receivers hundreds of times larger than themselves. China's attempts to break America's space-based network is futile. There's just too many targets to shoot at now. The preceding scenario isn't a piece of fiction from a war in the far-flung future. It's how a possible war with China would play out just 18 months from today. Early in September 2023, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks announced the Replicator Initiative, America's plan to win any conflict with China, not 10 or 20 years from today, but now. America faces a very significant risk of war with China and an equally significant challenge in fighting said war. The Chinese Communist Party, under direction of President Xi Jinping, has made it clear that reunification with Taiwan will happen, one way or another, either peacefully or by force. U.S. President Joe Biden broke the status quo and firmly stated that the U.S. would come to the defense of Taiwan in case of Chinese invasion, saying the quiet part out loud for the first time in U.S.-Chinese relations. But why should the U.S. care about Taiwan, and how would the Replicator Initiative win such a war? Taiwan is one of the most strategically important places on Earth for both China and the United States, as well as anyone who enjoys the liberal world order and would rather see democracy rather than Chinese-style autocracy continue to spread. Nations like Ireland have criticized narratives such as this and done so from the position of extreme privilege, safely on the westernmost edge of Europe away from potential hostile actors like either Russia or China, and deep in the bosom of US-led regional security. China's taking of Taiwan would be a catastrophe for the current liberal world order, as the island would make for a jumping-off point for further Chinese expansion into the Pacific. It would break nearly a century of containment of Chinese communism via what's known as the First Island Chain, a chain of US allies and partners that stretches from Japan to the Philippines. With China in Taiwan, the chain is broken, and it becomes significantly more difficult to deter further Chinese aggression, something that, again, countries like Ireland have the luxury of doubting, while China's neighbors, Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea, very much don't. China's bid to break the First Island Chain is a matter of self-preservation, or at least self-preservation for the Communist Party. Authoritarianism cannot thrive in a liberal world order, and already China feels the pressure of liberalism on its doorstep. The massive riots that shook Hong Kong to its core for months in 2019 and 2020 were proof that many Chinese are increasingly tired of the Communist Party and its oppressive policies. The Communist Party won in the end, to the great loss of the people in Hong Kong, but the incident spurred a wave of paranoia at the highest levels of Chinese power. To preserve their power, the Chinese Communists have taken to exporting authoritarianism regionally via the transfer of surveillance technology to like-minded states. They've also heavily meddled in the political affairs of neighbors, like any good would-be superpower does, and used everything from economic bribes to threats in order to steer global trends. But as long as the US and its partners can contain the Chinese military, China can only do so much to change their neighbors' opinions. Push the US out of the Pacific, though, and suddenly Chinese authoritarianism is backed up by a significant number of planes, ships, and tanks that dwarf anything regional powers can field. Taiwan is important for another reason, though. It's a key player in the global economy. Known as its Silicon Shield, Taiwan invested heavily into semiconductor manufacturing, becoming a global leader and manufacturing a significant supply of the world's most advanced computer chips. Unless Ireland figures out how to power their electronics with potatoes instead of computer chips, keeping the Chinese Communist Party from having a stranglehold on this global supply is the only way to safeguard national economies. And with China in control of the majority of the world's supply of advanced computer chips, every nation in the world, including the US, would be at its mercy. Do as the Chinese Communist Party says, or have fun watching your economy collapse to pre-1990s levels. The US's fight to keep China out of Taiwan is not just in the interest of America, it's in the interest of everyone who doesn't want Winnie the Pooh banned in their country. But the US faces a significant challenge trying to take on the Chinese military. On paper, while China recently acquired more ships than the US, the American military is more powerful by an order of magnitude. China has more ships, but American vessels are larger, carry more missiles, and still outclass their Chinese counterparts in key technologies. US submarines are more capable and stealthier, and the F-35 and F-22 haunt the dreams of Chinese fighter pilots. America's biggest advantage, though, is that much like Europe in the recent past, that Europeans like to conveniently forget about, war is basically a national pastime. The US has the greatest concentration of war colleges, and the most prestigious. Its defense industry is without peer. Americans absolutely love skipping doctor visits, content knowing that instead, another Tomahawk cruise missile was squeezed out of a Raytheon factory. And every 20 years or so, the US launches yet another crusade to bring freedom and democracy to people who may or may not have specifically requested it at the time. Despite this, America faces significant, some think insurmountable challenges in war against China. Because as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has taught us, numbers really do matter. Sure, Russia is basically just slapping cardboard on shopping carts and calling it a tank now, but it's managed to weather the storm of much more capable Ukrainian forces through sheer mass alone. This is bad news when the US looks at a conflict with China, because the F-35 and the F-22 will beat the pants out of the J-20, but there's only so many of either to go around, and China's fleet of J-20s keeps getting bigger every year. America's biggest weakness is the part that everyone who criticizes the US never likes to admit. US commitments are global, meaning that US forces are directly responsible for maintaining regional stability around the world. Without significant US military power in Europe, Russia and the Soviet Union before it would have either coerced or directly forced European nations into its sphere of influence. This has never been more apparent than today, when the entire European effort to aid Ukraine is but a fraction of what the US has been able to provide, highlighting the absolutely criminal state of European military readiness. In the Middle East, American sailors and Marines are basically all that's keeping Iran from launching a catastrophic regional war, or blackmailing the world by choking off vital global oil arteries running directly along its shores. In Africa, the US has provided a rallying point for local powers to concentrate their efforts on combating extremism and criminal enterprises. And in Asia, the US Navy is all that's keeping Chinese ships currently using water cannons on other nations' fishing vessels from simply blowing them out of the water instead. Such global commitments are America's Achilles heel, because that means that the US simply cannot concentrate its forces for an apocalyptic one-on-one slug match with China, lest bad actors take advantage of the lapse in US-led security to launch their own agendas. So when it comes time to take on the Chinese military, the US is basically only able to commit its Pacific Fleet, reinforced with selected deployments out of its other global commands. Suddenly, Chinese numbers, already prodigious, count for a lot. Enter the Replicator Initiative, America's answer to superior Chinese numbers. Not a new defense program per se, Replicator will not draw any additional funding from the defense budget. Instead, this program is an initiative to change how the US military looks at present and near-term problems, and how they can be solved rapidly and efficiently with off-the-shelf technology whenever possible. In a sense, it's a dramatic expansion of the US Air Force's Rapid Capabilities Office, which is tasked with quickly responding to evolving threats in a timely manner. Only it aims to steer the entire American military in new directions. Replicator is thus not specifically a program to counter China. That is simply its current objective. As announced by Deputy Secretary of Defense Hicks, in 18 to 24 months the current strategic environment will be reassessed, and a new goal, if necessary, is set. But for now, Replicator's goal is to neutralize China's numbers, and to do this it's taking lessons from the war in Ukraine. Estimates place Ukrainian drone losses at about 10,000 a month. This includes drones of all sizes and makes, from large Bayraktar surveillance and attack drones to smaller DJI drones purchased directly from commercial retailers. Ukraine has done something incredible, completely blunting the might of the titanic Russian military with cheap, attritable swarms of drones. It's impossible to glance at any news coverage of Ukraine and not see a new video of Russian troops and vehicles making brief but best friends with Ukrainian suicide drones. This is a capability America is looking to exploit and leverage against China's superior numbers. The current goal of the Replicator Initiative is to immediately begin researching how to implement drones in vast swarms on the land, the air, the sea, and even space, and how to do so largely using off-the-shelf commercial technology. Inevitably, though, new types of specialized military drones will be developed, similar to the Switchblade drones used in Ukraine today. However, the focus of Replicator is for these drones to be easily mass-produced and extremely attritable. That means these drones have to be cheap enough to be lost in large quantities without significantly hurting the DoD's pocketbook. China has created an excellent strategic position for itself in the Pacific, establishing a network of defenses meant to keep the US at arm's bay. Known as anti-access area denial, it's all in the name. Using aircraft, drones, and long-range missiles, China's hoping to keep US ships and aircraft far out of any fighting in the Western Pacific. The US's answer to A2D2, as the cool kids call it, is ADA2, because good God does the US love acronyms. All-domain attritable autonomy is meant to directly counter China's A2D2 capabilities by simply overwhelming Chinese A2D2 assets through sheer numbers of expendable drones. Larger US combat platforms can move in to win the fight. These drones will operate in large swarms, in all warfighting domains, even space. Traditional surveillance satellites, for instance, can take years to fund, produce, and finally launch, and can be completely destroyed by a single, cheap anti-satellite weapon. However, by simply putting up a networked swarm of drones doing the same job as a larger, more expensive satellite, America's space capabilities become so numerous to the point of it becoming utterly futile to attempt to take them out in the first place. We already have proof of the concept in Starlink, vital to Ukrainian war efforts, even if Elon Musk conveniently decided to shut Starlink down just as a Ukrainian drone swarm attack was about to descend on Russian ships in Crimea, causing the drones to go out of contact or drown. Remember this drone that washed up on a Crimean beach in September 2022? Turns out there's evidence that Musk sabotaged the drone attack by shutting Starlink down as the Ukrainians launched their attack, because he apparently believed that a strategic defeat in Crimea would prompt Putin to launch nuclear weapons. With Starlink service to Ukraine now funded by the Department of Defense, who we assume had a very long chat with Mr. Musk about his interference in the war, it's clear large swarms of satellites pose a nigh insurmountable problem for Russian forces. Likewise, Replicator aims to present just such a conundrum to the Chinese anti-satellite forces. The biggest bombshell of the Replicator initiative's announcement, though, was its timeline. Many thousands of new drones in active service in the next 18 to 24 months. This isn't another lengthy weapons acquisition program. It's a boot in the ass to the DoD's notoriously lengthy procurement timelines to get warfighters the tools they need tomorrow, today. Described as a more cultural shift than a physical program, Replicator is the product of a new reality. The US is back to great power competition, but unlike in the Cold War, technology today advances so rapidly that capabilities must be upgraded regularly, not decades apart. This is why the Block 4 upgrade for the F-35 is so vital, as it'll create an open architecture design for the fighter which will allow future upgrades to be installed faster and more cheaply. A similar attitude is already present in the U.S. Air Force's Next Generation Air Dominance program, which aims to field the world's first 6th-generation fighter, not in 2 decades, as a major fighter program typically takes to mature, but by 2030, as a combat-ready fighter no less. The news that an NGAD prototype had already taken flight in the late 2010s sent shockwaves around the world, especially as the first test flight came a mere few years after the program was officially announced. NGAD represents what the Replicator initiative aims to do with the entire U.S. military, not just the Air Force. U.S. military culture needs to shift away from a legacy systems mindset to one of constant innovation and rapid development. Technologies such as 3D printing are making this possible and are already being used to create the U.S. Army's replacement for the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. But the hardest challenge for Replicator is not devising new tools and capabilities, but rather changing the mindset of the personnel within the Department of Defense themselves, encouraging innovation and risk-taking as a way to ensure that the state-of-the-art is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. The year is 2013. Xi Jinping, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, has just seen the plans to transform some scattered reefs in the South China Sea into a fortified concrete island, complete with its own hospital, an airstrip, and a military base. Seemingly out of nothing, China will build a base from where strategic bombers can be based and fly thousands of miles from. This could be a stroke of a brush that paints the picture of the end of human civilization. If you think that sounds crazy, you may change your mind when you get to the end of the show. China has been very busy building more artificial islands like this, while much of the world has been looking the other way. China's Great Wall of Sand has been taking shape. This has caused many sleepless nights for folks in Washington. Before we get into the many reasons for the sleepless nights, let's look at this Great Wall of Sand. First named that by a U.S. admiral, the island we just mentioned in the intro is called Fiery Cross Reef. That's what it used to be, just a scattering of reefs. There was nothing there, but then that all changed. In 2013, China decided it was time to transform the place along with other land dotted around the South China Sea. In 2014, between the months of August and November, Chinese dredgers got busy moving a lot of sand around Fiery Cross Reef. Then came the concrete trucks to cover the sand. The end product was an island about 3,000 meters long and 300 meters wide. It wasn't long until Chinese people were in their living rooms watching China Central Television and being told about this state-of-the-art military island from where H-6K strategic bombers could take off. Brimming with pride, they were told there was a hospital there, but more importantly, military installations home to early warning radar systems and various weapon systems. China had created a monster in the South China Sea, and many more monsters would follow. If you went to Fiery Cross Reef today, you'd find garrisons that house something close to 200 troops. Some of them work with surveillance technology, some of them are weapons experts. In 2016, China landed passenger planes there, one from China Southern Airlines and another from Hainan Airlines. This is not an island anyone will be visiting on their vacation. The tests were merely to see what kind of large aircraft could safely land there. There are presently enough hangars to store 24 combat aircraft and 4 much bigger planes. As we told you, the runway is now long enough to accommodate one of China's Shan H-6N bombers. One of these beasts could take off from the island and perform combat operations as far as 3,500 miles away. The planes are capable of being refueled in the air and can fire air-launched cruise missiles. The CIA has been watching the development of these planes for decades because of their nuclear weapon-carrying potential. In 2019, the CIA heard that the newest rendition of the H-6N could carry the mother of all bombs. This is the most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the world. That might be worrying for the US, but it's just as worrying for other countries that are close to the island. This Great Wall of Sand that China has been building includes islands and areas that are disputed. In the Spratly Islands, China, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all lay claim to some of the land. Just about every single bit of land has 2 or more countries saying it belongs to them. It's a rather contested part of the world, so when China started building artificial islands on top of reefs and sticking military installations there, other countries didn't exactly look the other way. China's been making hay while its economy shines, creating these islands out of virtually nothing and then bringing in anti-aircraft weapons and anti-missile systems plus all kinds of surveillance tech. China is militarizing the sea, which you'll soon understand is not A-OK with the USA. The Philippines wasn't happy when China started to reclaim a place called Mischief Reef. Again, China sent in dredgers to suck up the sand and build a base, and then it concreted the base. What has been a series of reefs was suddenly home to a harbor and a runway. If you look closely, you can see anti-aircraft weapons and missile defense systems. The island also hosts soldiers and barracks and has an 8,900 feet long runway. Then there's China's disagreement with Taiwan over the Itueba Island, which is also part of the Spratly Islands. Satellite photographs show that right now there are armed soldiers there. A runway also has been built, along with radars and missile sites. But guess what? They aren't Chinese soldiers, they're Taiwanese soldiers. Those are Taiwanese weapons. As you know, China thinks Taiwan is part of it, but the Taiwanese would beg to differ. The Taiwanese people will tell you with a proud heart that they definitely ain't part of China. China calls Itueba Taiping. But get this, the Philippines and Vietnam also claim this island to be part of their country. One of the reasons is that the island lies not far from the fisheries and shipping lanes. There's oil and natural gas nearby, so there's an economic consideration too when arguing over these islands. It's not just about projecting military power. But perhaps more importantly, the islands are close to trading routes for the US said to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the American people. China has decided to reclaim many of the islands, so it's not surprising that Taiwan, a US ally, has stuck soldiers and weapons on Itueba. The fight over these places has gone on for decades, sometimes involving bloodshed. But it was really only in 2013 that China started transforming them into strategically useful military installations. The New York Times wrote not too long ago, despite claims of ancient historical links, Chinese officials in the first half of the 20th century were barely aware of the shoals and cays that make up the Spratlys until France annexed 6 of them, including Itueba. China is well aware of them now. These days, the islands are of utmost importance, and this has started to set off alarm bells for the Pentagon, not just around Asia. Take, for example, a place called Woody Island, the largest of the Paracel Islands, also in the South China Sea. Like the other islands, this place was not very significant in the past. It was just a bit of wild area that China, Vietnam, and Taiwan all thought was their own. Since 1956, China has claimed that they own the island. Nonetheless, the mega construction didn't start there until fairly recently. The island now has a large airstrip, military barracks, and weapon systems. It even has a bank. About 1,500 Chinese folks live there at any given time. The place has 2 or 3 artificial harbors where very large ships can dock. These ships could carry massive amounts of cargo, meaning that resupplying the island with weapons and supplies is easy. The runway can be used by bombers and every 4th-generation fighter plane China has. As you probably know, China has many highly advanced fighter planes these days. The stockpile keeps getting bigger and China keeps building runways for them. The US has been watching from a distance as the number of weapons increases. The New York Times wrote in 2016, China had put an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system on the island. Soon after, it reported that Shenyang J-11BH fighter aircraft were seen there. It goes without saying that what China does on such islands is not always open for global and public consumption, which is why the US has for years been surveilling the area as much as has been possible. Woody Island serves as an HQ for China in this area and gives the country considerable strategic power in the region. Vietnam is a country only too aware of this as it's close by. China has started sending passenger planes to the island and folks have been vacationing there or even getting married there. But experts say this is only about China trying to make the place look less like a militaristic joint that it is. Also, by turning it into an economic zone, it becomes harder for anyone to kick China out. Anyone would think China was preparing for war, but let's remember, China is like any other country in the world. Its main goal is to survive. It wants to maintain its power and sovereignty, and to do that, it needs those trade routes. Having power in this area means also having access to oil and gas, which China needs to have for its economy to remain stable. The US, meanwhile, arguably wouldn't be too upset if China's economy failed, even if the two nations do so much trade together. We'll come back to power politics soon. We very much doubt China would launch any attacks from these islands without a very big reason, but it sure wants to remain a force to be reckoned with in the area, as do some other Asian countries who have rightly accused China of breaking international law when it comes to creating those islands. The Philippines actually took China to court for breaking the rules, and it won. This was about fishing and food security in the Philippines, not really military stuff, although the Philippines, it must be said, is allied with the US. It also allied with China, which is why some pundits say it plays both sides. The Philippines asked the Obama administration for help over China's occupation of the Scarborough Shoal, but no help came, even though US officials condemned China's actions. Critics have said the US verbally admonishing China was not enough. Action needed to be taken against China. Not long after, the leaders of the Philippines turned away from the warm embrace of the US and went for drinks and cigars in China's backyard. Agreements were made between the two nations, China came out smiling, and the Philippines was told Chinese investments were coming its way. China has yet to build military infrastructure on the Scarborough Shoal, though. As the shoal is located only about 217 miles from the capital, Manila, China knows better than to put weapons there. But it's just good to have access to the area. Shipping lanes are like roads paved with gold. But more importantly, if China were to have a conflict with, say, the superpower of the world, having control of these shipping lanes would be absolutely crucial. Most Asian countries don't want to upset the economic behemoth of China, or at least a good number of Asian countries don't. That's because they're also survival machines. They're doing what they think is best for them. It should also be said that when it comes to disputes, China has a lot of sway within what's called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. China often throws its weight around, but that's hardly surprising. The US also wants to protect its shipping lanes in the region, so this is a turf war that in the very worst case scenario could trigger a real war. Every country involved is just looking after its own interests, but China is being blamed, rightly blamed, for wanting a bit too much. Still, it is threatened in this area. After all, the US has lots of allies in the vicinity. Let's just add here that it's thought that the trade that goes through the South China Sea is worth about $4.4 trillion. That's about a third of all global maritime trade. If US ships could control these shipping lanes with its giant navy, it could almost certainly bring China's economy to its knees if it chose to. It would cause massive suffering in China, but it would also cause global economic turmoil, so it's not as if the US would ever take such an action without there being some pretty hardcore circumstances. And we'll talk more about that soon. Check out embarrassing tourist mistakes you make in different countries, or watch this video instead.